When Duke Adrian Blackthorne finally knocked on his wife's locked door after 5 years of silence, he carried a letter that would shatter everything he thought he knew about marriage, power, and the brilliant woman he had spent half a decade ignoring. But Lady Lillian Hartwell didn't answer. She had stopped waiting for him long ago. What happened next would shake the foundations of English aristocracy and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is underestimate the woman sleeping down the hall. Stay until the end to see how one locked door changed everything. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. The November wind rattled the windows of Ravengate Hall like skeletal fingers seeking entry, but inside the East Wing, Lady Lillian Hartwell barely noticed. She sat at her writing desk, lamplight pooling across pages dense with botanical illustrations and careful Latin notations, her ink-stained fingers moving with the precise confidence of someone who had long ago stopped seeking approval for her work. Downstairs, in the cavernous study that smelled of leather and tobacco, Duke Adrian Blackthorne stood frozen before his mahogany desk, staring at a letter that had arrived with the afternoon post. The Royal Botanical Society seal gleamed in the firelight, official and undeniable. "Your Grace?" His secretary, Mr. Pemberton, cleared his throat nervously. "Shall I prepare a response?" Adrian didn't answer. He was reading the letter for the third time, each word landing like a physical blow. "We are pleased to inform the Duke of Ravengate that Lady Lillian Hartwell's groundbreaking research on medicinal properties of native English flora has been selected for publication in our quarterly journal. Her work on hedge garlic's antiseptic compounds represents a significant advancement in botanical medicine. We request her presence at our December symposium to present her findings." Lady Lillian Hartwell, not the Duchess of Ravengate. Her maiden name claimed back like stolen property. Adrian's jaw tightened. In 5 years of marriage, he had seen his wife perhaps a dozen times beyond formal dinners and required social appearances. She lived in the East Wing. He occupied the West. They existed in the same house like strangers sharing a coaching inn, polite, distant, careful never to intrude. That had been the arrangement, the deal. He had married Lillian Hartwell because his estate needed an heir, and she came with an acceptable dowry and unblemished reputation. She had married him because her father, the vicar of Hartwell Parish, had 6 daughters and no sons, and turning down a duke meant condemning her sisters to poverty. It was business, practical, civilized. So why did seeing her name, her own name, attached to groundbreaking scientific research feel like discovering his wife was a complete stranger? "Your Grace?" Pemberton tried again. "Leave me," Adrian said quietly. The secretary retreated with visible relief, the study door clicking shut with damning finality. Adrian moved to the window overlooking the north pastures. Frost glittered on the endless fields of his estate, 10,000 acres of England's richest farmland stretching toward the dark line of forest that marked the border of his domain. He had inherited Ravengate at 23 when his father died, and had spent the last decade building it into one of the most profitable estates in the country through sheer force of will and iron control. Everything here bent to his authority. The tenant farmers, the household staff, the village that bore his family name. Everything except the woman living in the East Wing. "Damn," he whispered to the frozen glass, because the truth he had been avoiding for 5 years was suddenly painfully clear. He had no idea who his wife was. The next morning, Adrian found himself doing something he had never done before. He followed her. Not overtly, that would have been beneath his dignity. But when he saw Lillian slip out the kitchen entrance at dawn, wrapped in a practical wool cloak that had seen better days, he found himself trailing her at a distance, staying to the tree line as she walked north across the frost-stiffened fields. The November air bit through his coat. His breath came in silver clouds. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravengate, master of 10,000 acres and commander of 200 souls, was skulking through his own hedgerows like a common spy. Lillian moved with purpose, her stride efficient and unhurried. She carried a leather satchel and a walking stick, and she stopped occasionally to examine plants along the hedgerow, her gloved fingers gentle as she turned over leaves, studied bark patterns, made quick sketches in a notebook she produced from her cloak. Adrian watched from behind an ancient oak, feeling like an intruder in his own domain. Who was this woman? She looked nothing like the pale, silent girl he had married 5 years ago. That Lillian had stood at the altar with her eyes downcast, her voice barely a whisper as she repeated her vows. She had trembled when he took her hand, flinched when the vicar pronounced them man and wife. This Lillian moved through the frozen morning like she owned it. When she finally turned back toward the house, Adrian let her go. He stood in the frost-brittle grass, watching her figure grow smaller against the gray November sky, and felt the first crack appear in the careful wall he had built around his life. That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining room as always. Adrian took his seat at the head of the long table. Lillian sat at the foot, 20 feet of polished mahogany stretching between them like an ocean. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice perfectly polite, perfectly distant. "Lillian." He nodded. The servants brought the first course. Crystal clinked against china. The fire crackled in the massive hearth. Adrian found himself actually looking at her for the first time in months. She wore a simple evening dress of deep green that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. Her dark hair was pinned up simply, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She had lost the softness of youth since their wedding. Her face had sharpened into something more defined, more striking. She looked like someone who had survived something. "I received a letter today," Adrian said abruptly, "from the Royal Botanical Society." Lillian's fork paused halfway to her mouth. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Fear? But it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Did you?" she said neutrally. "They mentioned your research, congratulated me on my wife's accomplishment." "How kind of them." "You didn't think to mention it?" Lillian set down her fork with careful precision. When she looked at him, her gaze was steady and utterly unreadable. "Would you have been interested, Your Grace?" The question landed like a slap. Adrian's fingers tightened on his wine glass. "You are my wife. Your accomplishments reflect on this household." "I see." Lillian picked up her fork again. "Then you may rest assured that I have conducted myself with appropriate discretion. The society is well respected. The research is sound. There will be no embarrassment to the Blackthorn name." "That's not what I—" Adrian stopped, frustrated. "How long have you been conducting this research?" 4 years. 4 years, he repeated. "Under my own roof?" "In the East Wing laboratory, yes. The room that was previously used for storage." Lillian took a small bite of fish, chewed, swallowed. "I hired a chemist from Cambridge to assist with the compound analysis. His fees were paid from my personal allowance, not the estate accounts. All proper receipts were maintained. She was reporting to him like a steward delivering a household accounting, professional, detached." "I'm not concerned about the finances," Adrian said tightly. "Then what concerns you, Your Grace?" "You've been conducting scientific research for 4 years, and I knew nothing about it." Lillian's expression didn't change, but something cold entered her voice. "You knew everything you wished to know, Your Grace. You knew I resided in the East Wing. You knew I took my meals at appropriate times. You knew I attended church services and social obligations as required. Beyond that," she paused, her hazel eyes meeting his directly. "You made it quite clear that my private activities were not your concern." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Adrian remembered their wedding night, the way she had stood by the window of her chamber, still wearing her wedding gown, her shoulders rigid with tension. "I will not impose upon you," he had said stiffly. "This marriage is a practical arrangement. You will have your own rooms, your own household allowance. I ask only that you conduct yourself appropriately in public." She had nodded once, relief flooding her face. He had left her standing there and never looked back. "You're right," Adrian said now, his voice rough. "I didn't ask, but I'm asking now." Lillian studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she lifted one shoulder in a slight shrug. "The hedgerows of northern England contain dozens of plant species with documented medicinal properties that have been largely ignored by formal science. Hedge garlic, in particular, shows remarkable antiseptic qualities when properly processed. My research isolated the active compounds and tested their efficacy against common infections." She delivered the explanation like she was reading from a prepared text, informative but utterly impersonal. "Why?" Adrian asked. "Why what, Your Grace?" Why study plants? Why medicinal properties? For the first time, something genuine flickered across her face. Because people die from infected wounds that could be prevented. Because tenant farmers can't afford physicians, but they can learn to recognize hedge garlic. Because knowledge shouldn't belong only to those who can afford it. The passion in her voice caught him off guard. This wasn't the dutiful recitation anymore. This was real. The tenant farmers, he said slowly. You've been treating them, teaching them. There's a difference. Lillian set down her napkin. If you'll excuse me, Your Grace, I have work to finish. She stood, and Adrian found himself standing too, some instinct making him rise. Lillian, he said. She paused in the doorway, not quite looking back. The symposium, Adrian continued. In December, will you attend? That depends. On what? Now she did turn, her gaze meeting his with quiet challenge. On whether you're asking as the master of this estate who controls my movements, or as a husband who actually cares what his wife does. Before he could answer, she was gone, her footsteps fading down the marble hallway. Adrian sank back into his chair, staring at the empty doorway. For 5 years he had convinced himself that this arrangement worked, that a marriage could function like a well-run business, two parties with clear roles, clear boundaries, clear expectations. But standing in the silence of the dining room, with 20 feet of empty tables stretching before him, Adrian finally admitted the truth. He had been lying to himself. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Adrian lay in his bed in the west wing, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, and heard every creak of the old house settling around him. At 2 a.m, he gave up. He pulled on a dressing gown and moved through the dark hallways, his bare feet silent on the cold floors. He found himself walking toward the east wing. He told himself he was just restless, just taking a walk through his own house. But his feet carried him inevitably to the corridor that led to Lillian's chambers and to the laboratory she had mentioned. Light showed under one of the doors. Adrian stopped, his hand raised to knock, and suddenly he was transported back 5 years to another November night, standing outside another door. Their wedding night. He had stood exactly like this, fist raised, frozen by uncertainty. In the end, he had retreated to his own rooms without knocking, telling himself it was the gentlemanly thing to do, telling himself she needed space, telling himself 1,000 lies that all meant the same thing. He was afraid of the intimacy she represented, afraid of needing someone, afraid of losing the iron control that had defined his life since his father's death. So he had locked her away in the east wing and told himself it was kindness. Now, standing in the dark hallway with light seeping under her door, Adrian finally understood what he had really done. He had built a prison, and the bars had locked both ways. He lowered his hand without knocking and turned away. But as he walked back toward the west wing, one truth burned clear. This couldn't continue. 5 years of silence. 5 years of separate lives under one roof. 5 years of a marriage that existed only on paper. Something had to change. Someone had to be brave enough to knock on that door. The next morning, Adrian summoned his land steward, Thomas Wickham, to the study. "I want to know everything," he said without preamble. Wickham, a practical man of 50 who had managed Ravengate's tenant farms for 20 years, raised his eyebrows. "Everything about what, Your Grace?" "My wife's activities. Where she goes, who she sees, what she does." Wickham's expression grew carefully neutral. "Your Grace, I'm not certain that's my—" "I'm not asking you to spy on her," Adrian interrupted. "I'm asking you to tell me what everyone else apparently already knows, and I've been too blind to see." A long silence. Then Wickham sighed and took a seat without being invited, a familiarity he would never normally presume, which told Adrian exactly how serious this conversation had become. "The girls' school," Wickham said quietly. "What girls' school?" "The one Her Grace runs. 3 mornings a week, in the old carriage house behind the north stables." Adrian stared at him. "She's running a school? On my estate?" "For the tenant daughters, yes. Started about 3 years ago. Reading, writing, mathematics, basic science. 9 girls currently enrolled." Wickham met his eyes. "I assumed you knew, Your Grace. The whole village knows." "The whole village," Adrian repeated slowly. "But not the Duke." "You never asked." The simple truth of it hit like a fist to the chest. "What else?" Adrian demanded. Wickham hesitated, then continued. She walks the hedgerows every morning before dawn, collecting plant samples. She's been documenting every species on the estate, not just medicinal plants, everything. She corresponds with scholars from Cambridge, Edinburgh, even some from the continent. She pays for it all from her own allowance. And she... He paused. Go on. She's beloved, Your Grace. By the tenants. They call her Lady Lily. When someone's child is sick, they go to her before they go to the village doctor because her remedies actually work and she doesn't charge them a penny. Adrian felt something cold settle in his chest. She's practicing medicine? She's sharing knowledge, Wickham corrected gently. Teaching mothers how to recognize the plants, how to prepare them safely. She's saved lives, Your Grace, including my own granddaughter last spring when infection set in after a bad cut. Your granddaughter. Aye. The fever had her near death. The doctor wanted to bleed her, but her Grace came with a poultice made from hedge garlic and something else. I don't recall the name. Within 2 days, the infection cleared. Within a week, little Sarah was running about again. Wickham's voice roughened. So before you think ill of her Grace for overstepping her position, Your Grace, you should know that every family on this estate would walk through fire for that woman. The study fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Adrian walked to the window, staring out at the frost-covered grounds. Somewhere out there, his wife was teaching tenant daughters to read, saving children with plants she collected from hedgerows, building a world entirely separate from him. The school, he said quietly. Who knows about it? Everyone but the neighboring gentry, I suspect. Her Grace asked us to keep it quiet, said it would cause trouble with the other estates if word got out that a duchess was educating peasant girls. She was right. Adrian could already imagine the scandal. Lord Pemberton would have an apoplexy. Lady Ashworth would never speak to us again. Does that matter, Your Grace? Adrian turned to face his steward. What? Does it matter what the gentry thinks? When the alternative is letting those girls grow up unable to read their own names? Wickham stood, his weathered face earnest. I know it's not my place to speak plainly, Your Grace, but you asked. So I'll tell you true. That woman you married might be the best thing that ever happened to this estate. Not because of her dowry or her family name, because she actually gives a damn about the people who work this land. The words hung in the air like an accusation. That will be all, Wickham, Adrian said stiffly. The steward nodded and left, but his words remained, echoing in the silence. She actually gives a damn. Adrian sank into his leather chair, the Royal Botanical Society letter still lying on his desk like evidence of his failure. For 10 years he had prided himself on being a good master, fair, just. His tenants had clean cottages and fair rents. His workers received their wages on time. The estate prospered under his management, but prosperity wasn't the same as care, was it? Lillian had seen the difference. While he had been managing accounts and maintaining property values, she had been learning the names of tenant children, teaching their daughters, healing their wounds. She had built an empire of kindness right under his nose, and he had been too proud and too blind to see it. What have I done? The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, undeniable. He had married a curious vicar's daughter with ink-stained fingers and a restless mind, and then he had locked her away like a possession he didn't quite want but refused to give up. And she had survived him. More than survived. She had thrived, building a life so full and purposeful that she didn't need him at all. The realization should have angered him. Instead, it filled him with something worse. Regret. That afternoon, Adrian did something he had never done in 5 years of marriage. He went to the East Wing, not to knock on doors or make demands, just to see. The corridors were different here, smaller, less grand. The servants' passages connected more directly to these rooms. These had been the family quarters once, before his father had built the massive West Wing addition. Comfortable, rather than impressive. He found the laboratory Lillian had mentioned. Through the closed door he could hear voices. Lillian's low and patient, and another voice he didn't recognize, male and cultured. Adrian's jaw tightened. A man in his wife's private laboratory. He was raising his fist to knock when the door opened and a young man emerged, nearly colliding with him. Your Grace! The man jumped back, his face flushing. He was perhaps 25, dressed like a scholar, with ink stains on his fingers that matched Lillian's. Forgive me, I didn't expect— Who are you? Adrian demanded. Mr. Peter Thornton, Your Grace, from Cambridge. I assist Her Grace with the chemical analyses for her research. He clutched a leather satchel like a shield. I was just leaving. I have all the proper documentation if you wish to— That won't be necessary. Adrian stepped aside. I trust my wife's judgment in selecting her associates. The words surprised him as much as they surprised Thornton, but they were true. Thornton nodded nervously and hurried away, leaving Adrian standing in the doorway. Lillian stood at a long table covered with glass beakers, plant specimens, and books. She wore a practical brown dress with an apron over it, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She looked like a scholar, a scientist. She looked nothing like a duchess. Your Grace, she said coolly, to what do I owe this intrusion? I wanted to see it, Adrian said. Your work. Why? Because I should have asked years ago. Lillian's hand stilled on the beaker she was cleaning. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she set it down carefully and turned to face him. You're standing in my laboratory, she said quietly. Uninvited, unannounced. Why? Because I'm trying to understand. Understand what? You. The admission cost him, but he forced it out. I read your letter from the Society. I spoke to Wickham. I've learned more about my own wife in the last day than I have in 5 years, and all of it makes me realize— He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Realize what? Lillian's voice was dangerously soft. That I've been a fool. The silence stretched between them, fragile as frost. Well, Lillian said finally, that's the first honest thing you've said to me in 5 years. Adrian flinched, but he deserved that. Show me, he said. Your work, please. Lillian studied him with those hazel eyes that missed nothing, weighing him like one of her specimens. Then she shrugged and gestured to the table. This is hedge garlic, Aliaria petiolata, common along hedgerows throughout England, but largely ignored by formal medicine. She indicated a row of beakers containing various liquids. I've isolated 3 distinct compounds with antiseptic properties. This one— She lifted a clear solution— shows particular efficacy against wound infections when applied topically. She spoke with quiet authority, moving through the specimens and explaining her methodology. Adrian listened, watching her face come alive as she discussed her research. This was who she was. Not the silent girl at the altar, not the polite stranger at dinner. This brilliant, passionate scientist whose eyes lit up when she talked about plant compounds and healing. The tenants, Adrian said when she paused. Wickham told me you've been treating them. Teaching them, Lillian corrected. I don't claim to be a physician, but most common infections can be prevented or treated with proper knowledge and access to these plants. Knowledge that shouldn't be locked away in university libraries where poor people can't access it. And the school? Her expression shuddered immediately. What about it? Why didn't you tell me? Would you have allowed it? She challenged. I don't know, Adrian admitted, but you should have given me the chance to decide. Like you gave me the chance to be your wife. The words came out sharp as cut glass. You made it quite clear on our wedding night that this was a business arrangement, Your Grace. I provided an heir, or would have, had you bothered to. She stopped, color flooding her cheeks. The unspoken truth crashed between them. 5 years married, no children, because Adrian had never once returned to her bed after their wedding night. Lillian, he started. Don't. She held up one hand. Whatever you're about to say, don't. I built this life because the one you offered me was a cage. A beautiful, wealthy, respectable cage, but a cage nonetheless. So yes, I started a school without your permission. Yes, I conduct research under my own name. Yes, I built an entire world you knew nothing about. Because it's mine. The only thing in this entire estate that belongs to me and not to the Duke of Ravengate. Her voice cracked on the last words, and Adrian saw it then, the cost of 5 years of silence, the loneliness of building a life in the shadows of his indifference. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Lillian laughed, a bitter sound. For what? For being exactly what you promised to be? You upheld your end of the bargain, Your Grace. I have my own rooms, my own allowance, my freedom to pursue my interests. You've been nothing but honorable." "Honor isn't enough," Adrian said. "No." Lillian met his eyes. "It isn't. But it's too late for anything else." She turned back to her beakers, dismissing him as clearly as words. Adrian stood there, wanting to argue, wanting to protest that it wasn't too late, that they could start over. But the truth was, he had no idea how. So he did what he had always done when faced with emotions he couldn't control. He left. But this time, something was different. This time, Adrian couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. That night, instead of reviewing estate ledgers, he found himself in the library, pulling down books on botany and medicine. He read late into the night, trying to understand the science behind Lillian's research. The next morning, he found himself taking the path to the North Stables. Following Lillian's route, the old carriage house stood back from the main buildings, partially hidden by overgrown hedges. Adrian had probably walked past it 1,000 times without really seeing it. Now he saw the new glass in the windows, the fresh paint on the door, the careful repairs that had transformed it from storage to schoolhouse. He could hear voices inside, young voices, reciting something in unison. Adrian pushed open the door. 9 girls sat on benches arranged around a makeshift classroom. They ranged from perhaps 7 to 14 years old, all dressed in their best clothes, all with slates and chalk in their hands. At the front of the room, Lillian stood before a blackboard where she had written a series of mathematical problems. Every head turned as he entered. The room fell silent. "Your Grace," Lillian said, her voice carefully neutral. "We weren't expecting visitors." The girls scrambled to stand, dropping awkward curtsies, their faces pale with fear. Adrian realized what they were seeing: the Duke, the master of their family's livelihoods, the man who could turn their fathers out of their cottages with a word. "Please," he said quickly, "sit. Continue your lesson." No one moved. Lillian's jaw tightened. "Your Grace, if you have concerns about the school, perhaps we could discuss them in private." "I have no concerns." Adrian looked at the girls' frightened faces. "I came to observe, if that's acceptable." Lillian studied him for a long moment. Then she gave a short nod. "Very well. Girls, please return to problem number 4. Slowly the girls sank back onto their benches, but their eyes kept darting to Adrian, nervous and uncertain. Lillian turned back to the blackboard. "Sarah, would you walk us through your solution?" A small girl with red braids stood hesitantly. If you have 3 pounds of flour and a recipe needs 1/4 pound per loaf, you can make 12 loaves? Correct. And can you explain your reasoning?" As the girl worked through the problem, Adrian found himself genuinely impressed. This wasn't simple arithmetic. This was practical mathematics applied to real-world situations. Flour weights, recipe calculations, market pricing. These girls were learning skills that would actually help them in life. The lesson continued: geography, history, basic science. Lillian moved through subjects with practiced ease, asking questions that made the girls think, praising effort over perfection. And slowly, the girls relaxed. They forgot he was there and returned to the joy of learning. Adrian watched his wife in wonder. This was teaching, real teaching, not the rote memorization he remembered from his own expensive tutors, but genuine education designed to give these girls agency in their own lives. When the lesson ended, the girls filed out, still casting nervous glances at Adrian. The last one, Sarah, the small redhead, paused in the doorway. "Your Grace?" she whispered. "Yes?" "Please don't make Her Grace stop. The school, it's—" Her eyes filled with tears. "It's the best thing that ever happened to us." Then she fled before he could respond. Adrian and Lillian stood alone in the empty schoolhouse. "Are you here to shut it down?" Lillian asked quietly. "No." "Then why are you here?" Adrian moved to the blackboard, studying the careful problems written in Lillian's precise hand. "Wickham told me you saved his granddaughter's life. I wanted to understand what kind of person does that. What kind of person builds a school in secret and teaches tenant daughters mathematics? What kind of person—" He turned to face her. conducts groundbreaking research and publishes under her maiden name because she doesn't want her work associated with her husband's title. Lillian's expression remained guarded. And what did you conclude? That my wife is remarkable, and that I've wasted 5 years being too proud and too afraid to see it. For the first time since he'd met her, Lillian looked genuinely surprised. Adrian, I want to know you, he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The real you. Not the polite stranger at dinner or the name on estate documents. You. The woman who walks hedgerows at dawn and teaches girls mathematics and saves children with plants most people consider weeds. Why? Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. Because in 5 years of marriage, I never bothered to ask. And I'm ashamed of that. And because... He stopped, the truth catching in his throat. Because the thought of spending another 5 years in silence is unbearable. The words hung in the cold air of the schoolhouse. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young. After 5 years, you can't just decide you want to know me and expect me to open like a book. I know. I built this life without you. I learned to not need you. I learned to not hope for... Her voice broke. Adrian took a step toward her, then stopped, uncertain. What did you learn not to hope for? This, Lillian whispered, this conversation, this interest. I learned to not hope that you would ever see me as anything more than a necessary inconvenience. The pain in her voice cut him to the bone. Lillian, No. She held up a hand, her composure returning like armor sliding back into place. You don't get to apologize your way into my life after 5 years of indifference. If you're truly interested in my work, you're welcome to attend the symposium in December. Beyond that, I suggest we maintain our current arrangement. It's worked adequately thus far. She walked past him toward the door, but Adrian caught her arm gently. What if I don't want adequately anymore? He asked quietly. Lillian looked down at his hand on her sleeve, then up at his face. For just a moment, he saw raw vulnerability in her eyes, hope and hurt warring together. Then she pulled away. Then you should have thought of that 5 years ago, Your Grace. She left him standing alone in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd built without him. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Duke Adrian Blackthorne had absolutely no idea what to do next. The only thing he knew for certain was that he couldn't let this continue. Somehow, some way, he had to find a way through the door that had stayed locked for 5 years. Because the alternative, a lifetime of silence, of parallel lives, of watching his brilliant wife shine for everyone but him, was no longer acceptable. The door had to open. And this time, Adrian would be the one brave enough to knock. Adrian's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened publicly enough that the servants noticed first. Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper who had managed Ravengate's domestic staff for 30 years, nearly dropped her tea tray when she found the Duke in the kitchen at dawn, 3 days after his visit to the schoolhouse. Your Grace, she pressed a hand to her chest. Is something wrong? Should I wake the cook? No need. Adrian stood awkwardly by the servant's entrance, dressed for riding. I was wondering, which path does Her Grace take on her morning walks? Mrs. Brennan's eyebrows climbed toward her cap. In 5 years, the Duke had never once asked about the Duchess's routine. The north hedgerows, Your Grace, past the tenant cottages toward Blackwood Forest. She hesitated. She left about 20 minutes ago. Adrian nodded and left without another word, leaving Mrs. Brennan staring after him with her mouth slightly open. He found Lillian a half-mile into the fields, crouched beside a frost-covered hedge, with her leather satchel open beside her. She wore the same practical wool cloak, her breath coming in silver clouds as she carefully sketched a plant specimen in her notebook. She didn't look up when his boots crunched on the frozen grass. The hawthorn berries are particularly interesting this year, she said without preamble. The early frost has concentrated their medicinal compounds. I'm documenting the variants. Adrian stopped a respectful distance away. May I watch? Now she did look up, surprise flickering across her face before the careful mask returned. It's your land, Your Grace. You may do as you please. That's not what I asked. Lillian studied him for a long moment, then shrugged and returned to her work. Don't disturb the specimens. So Adrian stood in the freezing morning air and watched his wife work. She moved with methodical precision, turning leaves, examining bark patterns, making quick notes in what he now recognized as Latin botanical nomenclature. Her gloved fingers were gentle with the plants, reverent almost. "Why hawthorn?" he asked after several minutes. "Cardiac properties. The berries and flowers both show promise for treating heart conditions." She made another notation. The tenant farmers have known this for generations, but formal medicine dismisses it as folk superstition. My research is documenting what they already know to be true, validating traditional knowledge, giving it the credibility that comes with scientific method and proper Latin names, Lillian corrected, so that physicians might actually listen instead of bleeding people to death. The bitterness in her voice surprised him. "You don't trust doctors." "I trust evidence." She closed her notebook and stood, brushing frost from her skirt. Most physicians still believe disease is caused by bad air and imbalanced humors. Meanwhile, women have been using these plants to heal their families for centuries. Tell me who deserves more trust. Adrian found himself smiling despite the cold. "You're angry at the entire medical establishment." "I'm angry at arrogance disguised as expertise." Lillian picked up her satchel. "But that's hardly a conversation for a frozen field at dawn." She started walking back toward the house, and Adrian fell into step beside her. "The symposium," he said. "In December. I'd like to attend, if you'll permit it." Lillian's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Why?" "Because I want to hear you present your research." "You've never attended a scientific lecture in your life." "Then it's past time I started." They walked in silence for several minutes, their boots crunching in rhythm on the frost. "They won't welcome you," Lillian said finally. "The Royal Botanical Society. They invited Lady Lillian Hartwell, not the Duchess of Ravengate. If you attend as my husband, it will change how they perceive my work. Some will assume you funded the research. Others will think you supervised it. All of them will credit you with my accomplishments simply because you're a man and a duke." Adrian stopped walking. "Then I won't attend." Now Lillian stopped too, turning to face him with genuine confusion. "What?" "If my presence would diminish your achievement, I won't come. Your work should stand on its own merit." "You'd stay away? From a public event featuring your own wife?" "It's not about me," Adrian said quietly. "It never should have been." For the first time since that moment in the schoolhouse, something softened in Lillian's expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to recognition. "I'll consider it," she said. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Adrian took it as the victory it was. The next morning, Adrian was waiting by the north hedge when Lillian emerged from the house at dawn. She saw him and sighed. "This is becoming a habit, Your Grace." "Adrian," he said, "when we're alone, please. I'd like you to use my name." "We've been married 5 years. I've never called you by your Christian name." "I know. I'm asking you to start." Lillian studied him in the weak dawn light, then shook her head slightly and moved past him toward her usual path. But Adrian noticed she didn't refuse. He followed her to a different section of hedgerow, watching as she documented winter plants with the same careful attention. After a while, he started asking questions, real questions, born of genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "What makes hedge garlic different from regular garlic?" Lillian glanced at him, clearly weighing whether he truly wanted to know. Then she pulled a plant from her satchel. "The compounds are similar, but the concentration and application differ. Allium sativum, common garlic, is primarily culinary. Aliaria petiolata, hedge garlic, has higher levels of the antiseptic compounds when properly processed, and it grows wild throughout England, which makes it accessible to people who can't afford to buy medicine." "Show me how to identify it." "Why?" "Because I own 10,000 acres of land where it grows, and I can't recognize it. That seems like negligence." Something flickered across Lillian's face. Surprise again, or maybe the beginning of respect. She taught him. Patiently, methodically, the way she taught the girls in her school. How to identify hedge garlic by its heart-shaped leaves and garlic smell when crushed. How to distinguish it from similar plants that might be toxic. how to know when it was ready for harvesting. Adrian listened and learned and tried not to notice how alive she became when she taught, her whole face lighting with passion for her subject. When they walked back to the house, he carried her satchel without asking, and she led him without comment. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. That afternoon, Adrian received visitors he hadn't expected and definitely didn't want. Lord Edmund Ashworth and Lord Henry Pemberton arrived in a coach emblazoned with the Ashworth family crest, clearly intending to make an impression. The two men were Adrian's closest neighbors among the gentry. Old families, old money, old ideas about how the world should work. "Blackthorn!" Ashworth boomed as he swept into the study without waiting to be properly announced. "Glad we caught you. We need to discuss a rather delicate matter." Adrian set down his pen with deliberate care. Ashworth. "Pemberton. I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "We didn't need one for something this urgent." Pemberton took a seat without being invited, his florid face already flushed with indignation. "It's about your wife." Every muscle in Adrian's body went tense. "What about her?" "She's running a school," Ashworth said bluntly, "for tenant daughters, teaching them to read and cipher like they're gentlewomen instead of farmhands." "I'm aware." "And you approve?" Pemberton's voice rose. "Good God, man, do you have any idea what kind of precedent this sets? My tenants are already grumbling about why their daughters can't attend. Lady Ashworth had to dismiss one of the kitchen maids because the girl had the audacity to ask if she might learn to read." Adrian leaned back in his chair, outwardly calm despite the anger building in his chest. "Perhaps you should have taught her." "Taught her?" Ashworth looked scandalized. "Blackthorn, these are peasant girls. They don't need education. They need to know their place." "And what place is that exactly?" "Working the fields, serving in houses, marrying tenant farmers and raising the next generation of workers." Pemberton leaned forward. "Education gives them ideas above their station, makes them dissatisfied with honest labor. Your wife is filling their heads with notions that will only make them miserable." "My wife," Adrian said softly, "is teaching 9 girls basic literacy and mathematics, skills that will help them manage household accounts, read contracts, understand their own tenancy agreements. I fail to see the harm." "The harm is disruption." Ashworth slammed his hand on the desk. "You're one of us, Blackthorn. Old family, real power. If you allow this nonsense to continue, every bleeding heart reformer in the county will think they can do the same. Next thing you know, we'll have tenant uprisings and demands for voting rights and God knows what else." "Perhaps that wouldn't be entirely unreasonable," Adrian said quietly. The room fell silent. Pemberton's face went from florid to purple. "You can't mean that." "I mean that 9 girls learning to read is hardly going to topple the social order." "It's not about 9 girls." Ashworth stood, his voice hard. "It's about what comes next. You open this door, and suddenly everyone wants to walk through it. Education for peasants, medicine for free, rights and reforms and all the chaos that comes with them." He leaned on the desk, his face inches from Adrian's. "Your father understood this. Your grandfather understood this. The natural order exists for a reason. Some people are born to lead, and some are born to follow. Educating the followers just confuses everyone." Adrian stood slowly, drawing himself to his full height. "Get out of my house." "Blackthorn, out, now." Ashworth and Pemberton exchanged glances. Then Pemberton stood, smoothing his waistcoat with offended dignity. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "Lady Ashworth is already planning to cut the Duchess from the winter social season. If you continue down this path, you'll find yourself quite isolated." "I'll survive," Adrian said. After they left, Adrian stood at the window watching their coach disappear down the drive, his hands clenched into fists. He understood now what Lillian had been protecting by keeping the school quiet. It wasn't just gossip she'd feared. It was active opposition from the very people whose approval she was supposed to crave. She had known they would react exactly like this, with outrage and threats and social punishment, and she had done it anyway. The thought filled him with something he hadn't expected: pride. That evening, Adrian broke protocol again. Instead of dining at opposite ends of the table, he had the servants set 2 places side by side. When Lillian entered the dining room and saw the arrangement, She stopped. What's this? I'm tired of shouting across 20 feet of mahogany, Adrian said. Sit with me, please. Lillian hesitated, then took the seat beside him, close enough that he could see the fine dusting of freckles across her nose, the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. I had visitors today, Adrian said as the first course was served. Ashworth and Pemberton. Lillian's fork paused halfway to her mouth. About the school. Yes. And? I told them to leave. She set down her fork carefully. You defended it. I defended you. Adrian. She stopped, seeming to realize she'd used his Christian name for the first time. Color rose in her cheeks. They threatened social isolation, Adrian continued. Said Lady Ashworth would cut you from society. Implied it was the beginning of peasant uprisings and the collapse of civilization. I told you this would happen, Lillian said quietly. I knew they would react this way. That's why I kept it quiet for so long. You shouldn't have had to hide it. Welcome to being a woman with ideas, Your Grace. We hide or we suffer the consequences. Adrian turned to face her fully. What if you didn't have to do either, hide or suffer? That's not how the world works. Then maybe the world needs to change. Lillian laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you can change society because you're the Duke of Ravengate? Even you don't have that much power. Maybe not, but I have enough power to protect you while you do your work. Enough power that Ashworth and Pemberton can bluster all they want, but they can't actually stop you. They can make life very difficult. Let them try. Lillian studied him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Why are you doing this, truly? Because I spent 5 years not seeing you, not asking questions, not caring what you needed or wanted or dreamed about. Adrian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. I can't undo those 5 years, but I can make sure that the next 5 are different. That starts with making certain you can do your work without fear. Lillian looked down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. You realize they'll come after you now, after your reputation, your standing. They'll call you weak for being controlled by your wife. Let them. Adrian, Lillian. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to forget 5 years of loneliness. I'm just asking for a chance to do better, to be better. She didn't pull her hand away. That felt like its own kind of miracle. The symposium is in 3 weeks, she said finally. If you truly want to attend, you should come. Not as the Duke trying to control his wife's work, but as... She hesitated. As what? As someone who actually cares about the science. I do care. Then prove it. Lillian pulled her hand back, but her voice was gentler than before. The hedge garlic research required hundreds of specimens tested under various conditions. The data analysis alone took 6 months. If you want to understand my work, truly understand it, you need to do more than watch me collect plants at dawn. Teach me, Adrian said immediately. It's not easy. The chemistry is complex. The Latin nomenclature takes months to learn properly. I have 3 weeks, and I'm a quick study when I'm actually motivated. For the first time in their marriage, Lillian smiled at him. A real smile, small and hesitant, but genuine. Very well, she said. Lessons begin tomorrow, but I warn you, I'm a demanding teacher. I'd expect nothing less, but... Adrian threw himself into learning with the same intensity he'd once applied to estate management. Every morning, he walked the hedgerows with Lillian, learning to identify plants by their Latin names. Every afternoon, he studied in her laboratory, reading the chemical analysis reports until his eyes crossed. Every evening, they dined together and discussed her research, and slowly, painfully slowly, she began to open up. Why medicine? He asked one night. You could have studied any branch of science. Why focus on healing? Lillian was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. My youngest sister, she said finally. Margaret. She died when she was 8, a simple infection from a cut on her hand. The doctor bled her, which only made her weaker. My mother tried to treat her with herb poultices, but the doctor forbade it, said it was superstition. Her voice went flat. Margaret died 3 days later. The doctor said it was God's will. My mother never forgave herself for listening to him instead of trusting her own knowledge. Adrian felt something crack open in his chest. I'm sorry. That's when I started studying plants seriously. I was 12. I wanted to understand why the doctor's treatment failed and whether my mother's herbs could have worked. I wanted... She stopped, her jaw tight. I wanted to make sure no one else's little sister died because formal medicine was too arrogant to learn from women who actually knew how to heal. That's why you use your maiden name, Adrian said, understanding dawning. Hartwell. For your family. For Margaret, Lillian corrected softly. So her death meant something. They sat in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. Adrian had spent 5 years married to this woman and never known she carried such grief, never asked about her family beyond the bare facts required for the marriage contract, never cared enough to look past the surface. The weight of that negligence settled on him like stones. Tell me about the symposium, he said finally. What will you present? Lillian's expression shifted, grief making way for nervous excitement. The hedge garlic compounds. Clinical efficacy data from 60 cases of wound infections, comparative analysis against standard physician treatments. The mortality rate with conventional bleeding was 40%. With the antiseptic poultice, it was less than 5%. Adrian's eyes widened. That's extraordinary. That's science, Lillian corrected. But getting physicians to accept it is another matter entirely. Most will dismiss the data because it comes from a woman. Those who don't will try to claim the methodology was flawed or the sample size too small. And even if they believe the results, actually changing medical practice takes decades. But you're presenting anyway, because someone has to start. She met his eyes. Someone has to stand up in front of the Royal Botanical Society and present evidence that challenges the establishment, even if they mock me, even if nothing changes, because not trying is worse than failing. In that moment, Adrian saw her clearly for the first time, not just the brilliant scientist or the dedicated teacher, but the warrior underneath. Someone who had chosen to fight an entire system despite knowing the odds were impossibly stacked against her. She was magnificent, and he had almost let her slip away. But the third week of November brought the first real snow, and with it, a crisis that would test everything. Adrian was in his study reviewing estate accounts when Wickham burst in without knocking, his weathered face pale. Your Grace, there's been an accident. The Hartley boy, Timothy, age 6, fell through the ice on the mill pond. They pulled him out alive, but he's in bad shape. Fever's already setting in from the cold water. Adrian was on his feet immediately. Have they sent for the doctor? Dr. Marsh is in town at another call. Won't be back until tomorrow at earliest. Wickham's voice dropped. The father's asking for her Grace. They found Lillian already halfway to the Hartley cottage, moving through the snow with her medical satchel in hand. Adrian caught up to her, matching her rapid pace. How bad? She asked Wickham without breaking stride. Lungs full of pond water, hypothermia. He's conscious but struggling to breathe. Inside the cottage, chaos reigned. Timothy Hartley lay on a bed by the fire, his lips blue, his small chest heaving with labored breaths. His mother knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. His father stood frozen, helpless, and terrified. Lillian moved like a field general taking command. I need hot water, clean cloths, and someone get that fire roaring hotter. We need to warm this room. She was already opening her satchel, pulling out vials and packets. Mrs. Hartley, I need you to hold Timothy still. This will be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. You can save him? The mother's voice broke. Please, Your Grace, he's my only boy. I'm going to try. Lillian's voice was calm but firm. Adrian, I need you to help hold him. He'll fight when I clear his lungs. Adrian moved to the bedside without hesitation, gently but firmly holding the boy's shoulders. Timothy's eyes were glassy with fever, his breathing a terrible wet rattle. Lillian worked with swift precision, tilting the boy's head back and administering something that made him cough violently. Water and mucus came up, and Timothy gasped and struggled, but Lillian was relentless. Keep him still. He needs to expel all of it, or his lungs will fill with infection. She worked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, forcing the boy to cough up the pond water. then administering tinctures and poultices with careful efficiency, a paste for his chest to ease breathing, a tonic to fight the fever, warm compresses to combat the hypothermia, all of it done with hands that never trembled and a voice that never wavered. Finally, Timothy's breathing eased, color began returning to his lips. His eyes focused, and he looked at his mother with recognition. "Mama," he whispered. Mrs. Hartley sobbed and gathered him into her arms. Lillian sat back, her own hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. "He needs to stay warm and dry. This tonic every 4 hours until the fever breaks. If his breathing worsens, send for me immediately. Don't wait for Dr. Marsh." "Thank you," Mr. Hartley said, his voice choked. "Your Grace, you saved his life. We'll never forget." The cottage door slammed open. Dr. Erasmus Marsh stood in the doorway, his black bag in hand and his face red with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. The room fell silent. Lillian stood slowly, drawing herself to her full height. "The boy was drowning in pond water. I cleared his lungs and treated the hypothermia." "You?" Marsh's lip curled. "You practice medicine without training or license? That's illegal, madam. Dangerous. I should report you to the magistrate." "Report her for saving my son's life?" Mr. Hartley stepped forward. "Doctor, with respect, you weren't here. Her Grace was, and she knew exactly what to do. She's a woman playing at science with folk remedies and superstition." Marsh moved to the bedside, examining Timothy with quick, rough movements that made the boy whimper. "The boy has fluid in his lungs. He requires bloodletting to balance the humors and—" "Absolutely not!" Lillian's voice cut like a blade. Marsh turned to stare at her. "I beg your pardon? You will not bleed this child. He's already weak from hypothermia. Bloodletting will kill him." "How dare you presume to tell me how to practice medicine? Because I actually understand how the body works." Lillian's composure cracked. "Bloodletting doesn't balance humors. It weakens the patient and makes infection more likely. The compounds I administered have documented antiseptic properties. Real science, not medieval theory." "Real science?" Marsh laughed, ugly and mocking. "You've read a few botanical texts and think you understand medicine? Madam, I studied at Edinburgh Medical School. I've practiced for 20 years. Who are you to question my methods? I'm the person who saved this boy's life while you were elsewhere. That should count for something." Marsh's face went purple. "Your Grace," he turned to Adrian, "surely you don't condone this. Your wife practicing medicine like some hedge witch, making a mockery of proper medical science?" All eyes turned to Adrian. He stood beside the bed where Timothy Hartley breathed steadily. Color fully returned to his face, alive because of Lillian's intervention. He looked at Dr. Marsh with his expensive education and 20 years of bleeding patience. Then he looked at his wife, standing straight despite her exhaustion, her apron still stained with pond water and fever sweat. The choice was remarkably simple. "Dr. Marsh," Adrian said quietly, "I suggest you leave." "Your Grace, my wife saved this boy using methods backed by scientific research and clinical evidence. You wanted to bleed him, which likely would have killed him. I know which approach I trust." Marsh sputtered. "This is outrageous. I'm the licensed physician, and you'll remain so. But not in this cottage, not for this patient." Adrian's voice hardened. "The Hartley family has made their choice clear. Please respect it. You'll regret this, Blackthorn, both of you." Marsh grabbed his bag. "Word will spread. Society will hear how the Duke of Ravengate allows his wife to practice illegal medicine, how you undermine proper physicians in favor of a woman's folk remedies. Your reputation will be ruined." "Then let it be ruined." Adrian moved to stand beside Lillian. "We'll survive." Marsh stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Hartley began to cry again, but this time with relief. "Thank you, Your Grace, both of you. We'll never forget this." Outside, walking back through the snow toward Ravengate Hall, Lillian finally spoke. "You realize what you just did. I defended your medical judgment over a licensed physician's. You destroyed your reputation. Marsh will tell everyone. The gentry already disapprove of the school. This will make it 10 times worse." Adrian stopped walking and turned to face her. Snow fell around them, soft and relentless. "Lillian, I watched you save a child's life with skill and compassion while a trained doctor wanted to bleed him to death. If defending that destroys my reputation, then my reputation wasn't worth protecting." She stared at him, snow catching in her dark hair, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been wonder. "You keep doing that," she whispered. "Doing what?" "Surprising me. Choosing me over everything you were raised to value. I don't—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything." Adrian reached out slowly, cupping her cold cheek with his gloved hand. "Just let me keep trying. Keep showing you that I see you now, that I value what you do, that I—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Too soon. Too much. But Lillian's eyes searched his face like she was reading one of her botanical texts, looking for truth in the details. "The symposium is in 2 weeks," she said finally. "If you attend with me, after this, it will cause a scandal. The Royal Botanical Society inviting Lady Lillian Hartwell is one thing. The Duke and Duchess of Ravengate arriving together after you've publicly defended her illegal medical practice will be quite another." "Do you want me there?" Adrian asked. "Yes," Lillian said, and the admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "Yes, I do." "Then I'll be there." They walked back to the house through the falling snow, and for the first time in 5 years, the distance between them felt like something that could actually be crossed. But as they reached the front steps of Ravengate Hall, neither of them could have known that the real test was still ahead. Because Dr. Marsh wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly, and society's wrath, once roused, could destroy far more than just reputations. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by special courier in the middle of breakfast. Adrian broke the seal and read in silence while Lillian watched from across the table. They still sat together now, close enough to share the morning light streaming through the windows. His face went pale, then hard as stone. "What is it?" Lillian asked. Adrian handed her the letter without a word. It was from the Royal Botanical Society. The elegant script seemed to blur as Lillian read, her hands beginning to tremble. "Dear Lady Hartwell, we regret to inform you that your invitation to present at the December symposium has been withdrawn. Recent reports regarding your unsanctioned medical activities have raised concerns about the credibility and propriety of your research. The Society cannot in good conscience provide a platform for work conducted outside proper academic and legal channels. We wish you well in your future endeavors." The paper crumpled in Lillian's fist. 5 years of work, hundreds of specimens tested, 60 documented cases of successful treatment, all of it dismissed in 3 sentences because Dr. Marsh had made good on his threat. "They can't do this," Adrian said, his voice dangerous. "They just did." Lillian set down the ruined letter, her hands remarkably steady now. "Marsh reported me, probably framed it as illegal medical practice and scientific fraud. The Society couldn't risk the scandal of associating with me. Your research is sound. The evidence is undeniable. Evidence doesn't matter when reputation is destroyed." Lillian stood, moving to the window. Outside, snow continued to fall on the grounds of Ravengate, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. "This is what happens when women challenge the established order. We get reminded of our place." Adrian stood too, crossing to her. "We'll fight this. I'll write to the Society myself. I'll testify to the validity of your research. You'll make it worse." Lillian turned to face him, her eyes bright but tearless. "Don't you understand? Your support is part of the problem now. They already think I'm just a bored duchess playing at science. If my husband defends me, it confirms their belief that I'm not a real scholar." "Then what do we do?" "I don't know." For the first time since Adrian had known her, Lillian's composure cracked completely. "I worked so hard. I was so careful. I used proper methodology, kept detailed records, verified every result. And it still wasn't enough because I made the mistake of actually saving a child's life instead of letting the licensed physician kill him." Adrian reached for her hands. "Lillian, don't." She pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Don't tell me it will be fine. Don't tell me another opportunity will come. This was my chance to prove that the work matters, that traditional healing knowledge has scientific validity, that women can contribute to medicine if anyone would just listen." Her voice broke. And I lost it, because I chose to help instead of staying silent. The words hung between them, bitter as poison. Adrian wanted to argue, to fix this, to use his power and influence to force the society to reconsider. But he was learning, painfully, slowly, that some battles couldn't be won with ducal authority. "What do you need?" he asked quietly. Lillian was silent for a long moment. Then she straightened, wiping her eyes with quick, angry movements. "I need to check on Timothy Hartley, make sure the fever hasn't returned." She moved toward the door, all business again. "After that, I have a lesson with the girls. Life continues even when dreams die." She left before Adrian could respond. He stood alone in the breakfast room, staring at the crumpled letter on the table, and felt rage building in his chest like a gathering storm. That afternoon, Adrian rode to the village alone. He found Dr. Marsh's office easily, a respectable building on the main street with a brass plaque announcing the physician's credentials. Adrian dismounted, tied his horse, and walked inside without knocking. Marsh looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face, before settling into smug satisfaction. "Your Grace, I wondered when you might pay me a visit." "You reported my wife to the Royal Botanical Society," Adrian said flatly. "I reported illegal medical practice to the appropriate authorities, as was my duty." Marsh leaned back in his chair. "Did you truly think there would be no consequences for undermining a licensed physician, for allowing your wife to play at being a healer? She saved a child's life. She got lucky. Next time, her folk remedies might kill someone. Then you'll understand why proper medical training and licensure matter." Adrian's hands clenched into fists. "You wanted to bleed a hypothermic 6-year-old? That's not medicine. That's murder disguised as tradition." Marsh's face darkened. "I've practiced medicine for 20 years. I've saved more lives than your wife has even seen. But you're right. I don't have a laboratory full of crushed weeds and superstitious nonsense. I have real training from real institutions. That should count for something. It counts for exactly as much as your results prove it's worth, which, in Timothy Hartley's case, would have been one dead child. Get out of my office." "With pleasure." Adrian turned to leave, then paused. "But know this, Marsh. You may have destroyed my wife's reputation in academic circles. You may have cost her the symposium. But if you ever interfere with her work again, if you so much as discourage a single-tenant family from seeking her help, I will use every ounce of power I possess to ensure you never practice medicine in this county again." Marsh stood, his face purple with rage. "You can't threaten me. I'm protected by professional organizations, by law, and I'm a duke with 10,000 acres and influence that extends to Parliament. Test me and find out which matters more." Adrian left before Marsh could respond, but the confrontation brought no satisfaction. Threats and power plays wouldn't restore Lillian's invitation to the symposium, wouldn't undo the damage to her reputation, wouldn't give her back the future she'd worked 5 years to build. He found Wickham near the North Pastures, overseeing winter preparations. "The Hartley boy?" Adrian asked without preamble. "Recovering well, Your Grace. Fever broke yesterday. He'll be back to causing mischief within the week." Wickham studied Adrian's face. "You've heard about the society letter." "News travels fast. The tenants are furious. They know what Her Grace's work means to them, even if fancy London scientists don't." Wickham hesitated. "There's talk of sending a petition. All the families she's helped. Testimonials about the lives she's saved." "To the Royal Botanical Society?" "Aye. Figured if they heard from the people who actually benefit from her research, they might reconsider." Adrian felt something twist in his chest. Thank you, Wickham, but I'm not certain it will help. The society cares about scientific credibility, not testimonials from tenant farmers." "Maybe that's the problem," Wickham said bluntly. "Maybe science that doesn't care about helping real people isn't worth much." The simple truth of it struck Adrian like a physical blow. All his life, he'd been taught that knowledge belonged to the educated elite, that universities and societies and gentlemen scholars were the guardians of truth, that common people needed to be led by their betters. But watching Lillian work, teaching girls who would never attend university, healing families who couldn't afford physicians, conducting research that prioritized accessibility over academic prestige, he'd begun to understand how hollow that belief was. Real knowledge, practical knowledge, lived in the hands of women who grew medicinal gardens, and midwives who delivered babies, and farmers who understood weather patterns better than any meteorologist. Lillian had been trying to bridge those two worlds, to validate traditional knowledge with scientific rigor, to make healing accessible instead of elite. And the establishment had crushed her for it. "Collect the testimonials anyway," Adrian said. "If the society won't listen, we'll find someone who will." That evening, Adrian found Lillian in her laboratory, packing her research materials into wooden crates with methodical efficiency. "What are you doing?" he asked from the doorway. "Clearing out. This laboratory was always temporary. I should have known better than to get comfortable." She wrapped a glass beaker in cloth, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. "Lillian, stop." "Why?" "So I can pretend this isn't over? The society rejected me. Marsh will report me to the magistrate if I continue treating tenants. The school will be shut down the moment word reaches the gentry, and it will reach them because Ashworth and Pemberton are probably already spreading the scandal." She placed the beaker in a crate with exaggerated care. "I was naive to think I could do meaningful work while being the Duchess of Ravengate. Those two identities were always incompatible." Adrian crossed the room, gently taking the beaker from her hands. "So you're giving up?" "I'm being realistic," Lillian's voice broke. "I can't fight the entire world, Adrian. I don't have the strength." "Then let me fight with you." "You can't watch me." He set down the beaker and took both her hands in his. "Lillian, I spent 5 years ignoring you, dismissing you, treating you like a piece of furniture that came with the marriage contract. I can't undo that. But I can stand beside you now. I can use my position and my resources and every ounce of influence I possess to protect your work. Your reputation is worthless if I'm the kind of man who abandons his wife when she needs him most." Adrian's grip tightened. The symposium invitation was withdrawn. "Fine. We'll find another venue, another audience. The medical establishment rejects your research? We'll publish it independently. Marsh threatens legal action? I'll retain the best solicitors in England." Lillian stared at him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Why are you doing this?" "Because 5 years ago, I married a brilliant woman and spent every day since trying not to see how extraordinary she was. Because I'm ashamed of that. Because I want to be worthy of you, even though I know I'm not." Adrian released her hands, stepping back. "And because someone needs to stand up and say that what you're doing matters. That healing people matters more than protecting the pride of incompetent physicians. That educating girls matters more than maintaining the social order. You'll lose everything." "Then I'll lose it." Adrian's voice was steady, certain. "But I won't lose you, not again. Not when I finally understand what I have." The laboratory fell silent except for the hiss of the gas lamps. Lillian wiped her eyes, studying him like she had that first night in the conservatory, searching for truth, for sincerity, for something worth believing in. "There's a publisher in Edinburgh," she said finally. "Dr. James Whitmore. He specializes in controversial medical research. Research that challenges conventional wisdom." "Controversial, like documenting that bloodletting kills patients?" "Exactly like that." A small smile touched Lillian's lips. "He's been corresponding with me for months, asking if I'd consider writing a book. A comprehensive guide to medicinal plants of Britain, with clinical data and accessible preparation methods." Adrian's heart began to race. "What did you tell him?" "That I was waiting to present at the symposium first, to establish credibility before attempting something so ambitious." Lillian's smile faded. "But now that credibility is destroyed anyway, so perhaps there's nothing left to lose. When does he need an answer?" "He's given me until January, but the work would require months in Edinburgh, access to university libraries, collaboration with his research team, time away from—" She gestured vaguely at the laboratory, the estate beyond. "From Ravengate," Adrian finished. "From your responsibilities as Duchess. From everything I've built here. The school. The tenants who depend on me. I'd have to leave it all behind to pursue this." Adrian thought of the girls in the schoolhouse, learning mathematics and dreaming of futures beyond the limits society set for them. He thought of Timothy Hartley, alive because Lillian had been there when he needed her. He thought of all the lives she touched daily just by being present, by caring, by refusing to let her work exist only in theory. "What if you didn't have to choose?" he said slowly. "What do you mean?" "The school, the medical work. It shouldn't depend entirely on you. That's not sustainable, even if you stayed." Adrian's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. What if we formalized it, hired a proper teacher for the girls, trained several women in basic medical treatment so the knowledge isn't concentrated in one person, made it an actual institution instead of one woman's secret project? Lillian's eyes widened. That would cost money, significant money. "I have money." "It would cause a scandal. The neighboring estates can go to hell." Adrian smiled. "Lillian, they already think I'm ruined. Might as well earn the reputation properly." For the first time since reading the Society's letter, genuine hope flickered across Lillian's face. "You'd do that? Fund a school and medical training program while I'm in Edinburgh?" "I'd do more than fund it. I'd run it. Learn your methods. Continue your work." Adrian caught her hands again. "You taught me to identify hedge garlic. Teach me the rest. Teach me enough that I can maintain what you've built while you're creating something bigger." "Adrian, that would take months of intensive study." "Then we'd better start now." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Go to Edinburgh. Write your book. Prove to the world that your research matters. I'll hold Ravengate together until you return." Lillian's breath hitched. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." She pulled back just far enough to search his face, her hazel eyes bright with tears and something else, something that might have been trust. "If I go," she said slowly, "if I accept Whitmore's offer and spend months away, things will change. Between us. This," she gestured at the small space between them, "whatever this is becoming, it won't survive months of separation. Then we'll have to make sure it's strong enough before you leave." "And if it's not?" Adrian cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Then I'll spend every day you're gone becoming someone worth coming back to." Lillian laughed, shaky and breathless. "You can't just... We've been married 5 years and barely spoke until 3 weeks ago. You can't expect me to believe you've changed completely in less than a month." "I don't expect you to believe anything. I'm asking you to let me prove it." The laboratory was warm despite the winter cold outside, heated by the gas lamps and something else, something fragile and new growing in the space between them. 3 months, Lillian said finally. "Until I leave for Edinburgh. 3 months to train you, formalize the school, set up sustainable systems. 3 months to see if this," she placed her hand over his heart, "is real or just guilt and good intentions." 3 months, Adrian agreed. "And Lillian?" "Yes?" "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I wasted 5 years, but I swear to you I will spend every remaining day proving that I see you, that I value you, that I—" The words caught too big and too soon, but Lillian heard them anyway. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered. "Then I'll only promise what I know I can deliver. I will try, every single day." For the first time in their marriage, Lillian kissed him. It was brief and tentative and tasted like salt from her tears. But it was real. When she pulled away, her expression had shifted from despair to determination. "We have work to do," she said. "If you're going to run this operation in my absence, you need to know everything. The plant identification is just the beginning. You need to understand compound extraction, proper dosing, storage methods, clinical observation. Then teach me. It won't be easy." "Good. Nothing worth doing is." Lillian smiled, truly smiled, and Adrian felt something settle in his chest, something that felt remarkably like hope. The next 3 months were a crucible that forged them both into something new. Adrian threw himself into learning with ferocious intensity. He spent mornings walking the frost-covered hedgerows, learning to identify every medicinal plant on the estate. Afternoons in the laboratory, watching Lillian extract compounds and prepare treatments. Evenings studying medical texts until his eyes burned. But more than that, he learned to listen. He attended every lesson at the girls' school, watching Lillian teach with patience and passion. He observed her treating tenants, noting how she explained each step so patients understood their own healing. He asked questions constantly. Why this plant instead of that one? Why this dosage? Why this preparation method? And slowly, painfully, he began to understand not just the technical knowledge, but the philosophy behind it. Lillian's approach to medicine wasn't about control or authority, it was about empowerment, teaching people to recognize their own symptoms, understand their treatment options, make informed decisions about their health. It was revolutionary in a way the Royal Botanical Society would never understand because it threatened the entire foundation of medical authority. December brought the symposium that Lillian would never attend. They didn't speak of it, but Adrian saw her staring out windows on those days, her expression distant and aching. "Tell me about the book," he said one evening, finding her in the library. "What about it?" "Everything. What will it contain? Who is it for?" Lillian set down the paper she'd been reading. A comprehensive field guide to medicinal plants of Britain, full botanical descriptions with illustrations, documented clinical effects, preparation methods simple enough for anyone to follow, contraindications and safety warnings, everything someone needs to use these plants safely and effectively. Who's the audience? Everyone who can't afford physicians, tenant farmers, village mothers, anyone who needs healing and has been told their traditional knowledge is worthless superstition. Her voice grew passionate. "I want to create something that validates what women have known for centuries while making it accessible to the next generation. A bridge between traditional healing and scientific medicine." "How long will it take?" "A year at minimum, maybe 2. The research is done, but writing, illustration, peer review, publication, it's a massive undertaking." "What if it fails? What if Whitmore's press doesn't have the reach you need?" Lillian smiled sadly. "Then I'll have tried and failed, which is better than never trying at all." Adrian crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. "It won't fail," he said quietly, "because I'm going to make sure every tenant family in the county has a copy, and I'm going to send copies to every estate owner I know. And I'm going to personally fund distribution to village libraries across England." "Adrian, that would cost—" "I don't care what it costs. This work matters. Your work matters. And I will move heaven and earth to make sure the world knows it." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" "Because 5 years ago, I married someone extraordinary and spent every day since trying to make her small enough to fit into my comfortable worldview. I'm done with that. I want to see you take up all the space you deserve. I want to watch you change the world." She kissed him then, deeper than before, her hands tangling in his hair. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," Lillian whispered, "to Edinburgh." Adrian's heart stuttered. "What?" "Don't stay here managing things while I'm gone. Come with me. We'll work on the book together. You can continue your training with Whitmore's team. We can—" She stopped, vulnerability flickering across her face. "We can actually be married, not just in name, but in truth." The offer was everything Adrian wanted and everything he feared. "What about the school?" he asked. "The tenants?" "We'll find someone to manage them. Mrs. Brennan is capable. Wickham can oversee the medical training, but Adrian—" She cupped his face. "I don't want to spend a year away from you. Not now, not when we're finally—" "Building something real," Adrian finished. Yes, he thought of Ravengate, the estate that had defined his entire life, the land he'd been born to manage, the responsibility he'd been raised to fulfill. And he thought of Lillian, brilliant and brave, and finally willing to let him into her world. The choice was remarkably simple. "Yes," he said, "I'll come with you." Lillian's smile could have lit the entire library. She kissed him again, and this time Adrian let himself fall into it. 5 years of distance, finally collapsing into something warm and immediate and terrifyingly real. But happiness, they would learn, was a fragile thing. The letter came on a Tuesday in early February, delivered along with the regular post. Adrian opened it while Lillian sorted through botanical journals, both of them comfortable in the shared silence that had replaced 5 years of careful distance. The seal was official, the handwriting precise. Adrian read the first line and felt the world tilt. No, he whispered. Lillian looked up. What is it? My cousin, Richard. Adrian's hands were shaking. He's filed a legal petition claiming I'm unfit to manage the Ravengate estate. The room went silent except for the crackle of the fire. On what grounds? Lillian asked, her voice very calm. Multiple grounds, apparently. Allowing illegal medical practice on estate property, funding unsanctioned education for tenant daughters, publicly undermining licensed physicians, threatening to abandon estate management duties to travel to Scotland. Adrian's voice was hollow. He's arguing that I've become irrational under the influence of my wife and can no longer be trusted with the family legacy. Lillian's face had gone pale. Can he do that? With the right support, yes. If he convinces enough members of the extended family that I'm mismanaging the estate, they can petition the courts to remove me as Duke and transfer the title to him as nearest male heir. But you haven't mismanaged anything. The estate is prosperous. The estate is profitable. But I've violated every social convention that defines what a duke should be. I've rejected the advice of neighboring gentry. I've allowed my wife to practice medicine without license. I've proposed abandoning my ancestral home to support my wife's career. Adrian set down the letter. Richard doesn't have to prove incompetence. He just has to prove I'm no longer behaving like the Duke of Ravengate should. Then we cancel Edinburgh, Lillian said immediately. We stay here. We prove you're committed to the estate. No. Adrian, no. He stood, pacing to the window. That's exactly what they want. For us to retreat. For you to give up your work and return to being the invisible Duchess. For everything to go back to the way it was. Better that than losing everything. Is it? Adrian turned to face her. Lillian, what kind of life is that? You silent and suffocating while I play at being the proper Duke? Both of us miserable but respectable? It's survival. It's surrender. Adrian crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair again. I won't do it. I won't let them win by threatening the one thing they think I can't live without. Can you live without it? Lillian asked quietly. Ravengate is your family legacy, your entire identity. If you lose it, then I lose it, but I won't lose you, not again. Lillian's eyes filled with tears. That's not a choice you should have to make. It's not a choice at all. Adrian took her hands. You are my choice. You've been my choice since the moment I knocked on your door, and you didn't answer because you'd stopped waiting for me years ago. Everything else, the title, the estate, the legacy, it only matters if I'm worthy of it, and I'm only worthy of it if I'm worthy of you. Adrian, be rational. I spent 30 years being rational. It made me powerful and respected, and completely alone. He pressed his forehead to her hands. I'd rather be ruined with you than successful without you. The words hung in the air like a vow. Lillian pulled her hands free, standing abruptly and moving to the window. Adrian watched her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths, watched her struggle with the weight of what he'd offered. There has to be another way, she said finally. If there is, I don't see it. Richard has the law on his side. He has the support of families like the Ashworths and Pembertons who already think I've lost my mind. And he has 5 years of documented evidence that I neglected my marriage and then suddenly changed completely after my wife started practicing illegal medicine. They'll say I influenced you, manipulated you. They'll say worse than that. They'll call you a fortune hunter who seduced a duke and led him astray. They'll claim your research is a sham designed to gain notoriety. They'll destroy your reputation along with mine. Lillian turned to face him, her expression fierce. Let them try. I've survived worse. Have you? Adrian stood. Lillian, this won't be quiet gossip and withdrawn invitations. This will be a legal battle that plays out in court and in the papers. Every detail of our marriage will be examined. Every unconventional choice will be used as evidence of my unfitness. They'll paint you as either a manipulative schemer or a deluded woman playing at science. Either way, your work will be dismissed as the hobby of a troublesome duchess. Then what do you suggest we do? Surrender? Cancel Edinburgh and burn my research and pretend the last 3 months never happened? No, we fight. Adrian's voice was steady now, certain. But we fight smart. We don't give Richard ammunition by running away to Scotland. We stay here. We formalize everything, the school, the medical program, proper legal structures that prove this is legitimate work, not whimsy. We document every success, every life saved, every girl educated. We build a case that shows I'm not irrational. I'm innovative. That will take months, Lillian said. Whitmore needs an answer about the book by January. If I wait too long, then we lose the book opportunity. But we keep Ravengate. We keep the ability to continue your work here, on our terms. Lillian shook her head. You're asking me to choose between my research and your legacy. I'm asking us to be strategic instead of impulsive. If we can prove to the courts that my support of your work is justified, rational, and beneficial to the estate, we win everything. Your research continues, the school stays open, and Richard's petition fails. And if we can't prove that, then we lose anyway. But at least we'll have tried. The logic was sound, the strategy made sense, but Lillian's expression was stricken, and Adrian understood why. She had already sacrificed so much. The symposium, her reputation with the Royal Botanical Society, 5 years of building a life in secret because she couldn't do it openly. Now he was asking her to sacrifice again, to delay Edinburgh, to put her book on hold, to fight a legal battle that would expose every private part of their marriage to public scrutiny, all to save a title and estate that had never valued her anyway. I can't ask this of you, Adrian said quietly. It's not fair. None of this is fair, Lillian's voice broke. But you're right. If we run now, we lose everything anyway. At least if we fight, we have a chance. We don't have to decide tonight. Yes, we do. Lillian straightened, wiping her eyes with fierce determination. Because if we're going to fight this, we need to start now. We need solicitors, evidence, testimonials, a strategy that proves you're not under my influence. You're acting from rational conviction. Lillian, I'll write to Whitmore, explain the situation, ask for an extension on the book contract. Her voice was steady now, controlled. And we'll start documenting everything, every successful treatment, every girl's progress in school, every way my work has benefited this estate and its people. Adrian crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his chest. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm so sorry. Don't be. This isn't your fault. It is. If I hadn't spent 5 years ignoring you, if I'd supported your work from the beginning, we wouldn't be facing this now. If you'd supported my work from the beginning, Richard would have filed this petition 5 years ago instead of now. At least this way we have evidence of success, proof that what we're doing works. She was right, but it didn't make the situation any less devastating. They stood together in the library, holding each other while outside the winter wind howled and the future they'd planned for crumbled into uncertainty. Somewhere in London, Richard Blackthorne was probably celebrating his brilliant strategy. But here in Ravengate, in the library where they'd finally learned to talk to each other, Adrian and Lillian made a different kind of plan. They would fight, not with the weapons of traditional power, authority and influence and social standing, but with evidence, with truth, with the testimonies of every life Lillian had touched, and every girl she'd educated and every family she'd saved. They would prove that a duke could change, that a marriage could transform, that sometimes the most rational thing a man could do was trust the brilliant woman he'd been fool enough to ignore. And if they lost everything in the process? Well, Adrian thought, tightening his arms around his wife, at least they would lose it together. The door that had stayed closed for 5 years was finally open, and nothing, not Richard, not the courts, not society itself, would make them shut it again. The solicitor's office in London smelled of old leather and older money. Adrian sat across from Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, no relation to Lillian's family, and watched the man's expression shift from professional interest to genuine alarm as he reviewed Richard's petition. Your cousin has been thorough, Hartwell said finally, setting down the documents. He's gathered statements from 3 neighboring landowners, 2 physicians, and a magistrate, all testifying that your recent behavior constitutes a dramatic departure from established norms of estate management. Established norms that include ignoring tenant welfare and maintaining the status quo regardless of evidence? Adrian kept his voice level. Established norms that define what it means to be Duke of Ravengate. Hartwell removed his spectacles, polishing them with methodical care. Your Grace, I won't mince words. This petition has merit. Your support of your wife's medical activities, the school, the public conflict with Dr. Marsh, these things give your cousin grounds to question your judgment. My judgment saved a child's life. Your wife's intervention saved a child's life. You merely defended her afterward. Hartwell replaced his spectacles. The distinction matters in court. The question isn't whether the outcome was beneficial. The question is whether a duke should be involving himself in such matters at all. Adrian leaned forward. Then we need to change the question. I'm not certain I follow. Richard's argument rests on the assumption that my actions are irrational, driven by emotion rather than sound judgment. We prove him wrong by demonstrating that my support of Lillian's work is based on documented evidence of success. Hartwell's eyebrows rose. You want to put her research on trial. I want to put her results on trial. Clinical outcomes, mortality rates, educational achievement, hard data that proves supporting her work is the rational choice, not the abandonment of duty. For the first time since the meeting began, something like interest flickered in Hartwell's eyes. That's unconventional. So is everything else about this situation? Might as well lean into it. Hartwell was silent for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk. Then he nodded slowly. We'll need extensive documentation. Medical records, if such things exist, testimonials from patients, educational assessments of the girls in the school, financial records proving the estate remains profitable despite your unconventional management. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. And we'll need character witnesses, people of standing who can testify that your judgment remains sound. That might be difficult, Adrian admitted. Most of the gentry consider me either mad or compromised. Then we find witnesses outside the gentry, tenant leaders, local merchants, village officials, people who can speak to the practical impact of your wife's work. Hartwell began making notes. The key is demonstrating that your support isn't blind devotion. It's evidence-based decision-making that happens to challenge social convention. Adrian felt hope stir for the first time since reading Richard's petition. Can we win? Honestly, I don't know. Hartwell met his eyes. But we can make them work for it. And if we're very fortunate and very strategic, we might just change the conversation entirely. Lillian threw herself into documentation with the same intensity she'd once applied to botanical research. Every treatment she'd administered in the past 3 years was recorded in meticulous detail. Patient name, condition, intervention, outcome. Every successful case became evidence. Every life saved became proof. Adrian watched her work late into the nights, her hand cramping from writing, her eyes red from exhaustion. You should rest, he said one evening, finding her still at her desk past midnight. Can't. Hartwell needs everything by the end of the month. She didn't look up from the ledger where she was recording details of a wound infection she'd treated 2 years ago. Do you remember the Cooper family? Their eldest son had the farming accident? Thomas Cooper nearly lost his arm to infection, but didn't because I treated him with hedge garlic poultice and willow bark for the fever. Lillian made another notation. He's working the fields again, full recovery. That's documented proof that the methods work. Adrian pulled up a chair beside her. Let me help. You have your own documentation to manage, which is mostly complete. The estate ledgers speak for themselves. Ravengate is more profitable now than it was 5 years ago, despite my supposedly irrational behavior. He took a spare ledger. Tell me what you need recorded. So they worked together, side by side, building a case from the evidence of Lillian's quiet revolution. Each entry was a life touched, a crisis averted, a future made possible. By 3 a.m, they had documented 63 successful medical interventions, ranging from simple wound care to life-threatening fevers. 9 girls educated beyond basic literacy, 3 of whom could now assist Lillian with her work. 17 families who credited the school and medical program with improving their quality of life. It's not enough, Lillian said, staring at the stacks of evidence. Richard will argue this is all anecdotal, folk medicine that happened to work by chance. Then we give them something they can't dismiss. Adrian stood, pacing the length of the library. The Royal Botanical Society rejected your research because of the scandal. But the research itself was sound, wasn't it? The methodology was rigorous? Yes, but so we find someone else to review it. Someone with unimpeachable credentials who can testify that your work meets scientific standards. Lillian shook her head. Adrian, no reputable scientist will touch this. Not after the Society's rejection. It would damage their own credibility. What about Dr. Whitmore? He wanted to publish your book. He must believe in the research. Whitmore publishes controversial work, but he's not... Lillian stopped, her eyes widening. Wait, Whitmore studied under Dr. James Lind, the physician who proved citrus prevents scurvy. And Lind's work was initially rejected by the medical establishment, Adrian said, seeing where she was going. Exactly. Whitmore specializes in validating research that challenges medical orthodoxy. Lillian stood, energy returning to her exhausted frame. If he reviews my methodology and confirms it meets scientific standards, that's expert testimony that contradicts Richard's claims of irrationality. Will he do it? Only one way to find out. Lillian's letter to Dr. Whitmore was a masterpiece of professional restraint, explaining the situation without begging, requesting his evaluation without demanding his support. She sent it express post, and then they waited. While they waited, Adrian took a different approach. He called a meeting of all the tenant families on the estate. They gathered in the largest barn on a cold February afternoon, 50 adults crowding into the space, their faces wary and uncertain. These were people accustomed to being told what to do by their betters, not consulted. Adrian stood before them, feeling the weight of their attention like a physical thing. You've heard by now about the legal petition my cousin has filed, he began without preamble. He claims I'm unfit to manage this estate because I've allowed unconventional practices, Her Grace's medical work, and the girls' school. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He's right that these practices are unconventional, Adrian continued. What he's wrong about is whether they've harmed the estate. So I'm asking you directly, has the Duchess's work helped or harmed your families? Silence. Then Thomas Cooper stood, his arm, the one he'd nearly lost, whole and strong. Her Grace saved my arm, Your Grace. Doctor wanted to take it off, said infection was too far gone. But the Duchess, she had a different idea. Used her remedies, and I kept my arm, still working, still providing for my family. That's help, not harm. A woman stood next, Mrs. Harrison, whose daughter attended the school. My Eliza can read now, write her own name, do sums faster than I can. She's learning things I never dreamed a girl like her could learn. Her voice shook. That's opportunity, Your Grace. That's a future. One by one they stood. Parents whose children had been healed, families whose daughters now had education, workers who had received fair treatment and genuine care instead of distant authority. I need your help, Adrian said when they finished. The court will decide whether supporting this work makes me rational or irrational. Your testimony could make the difference. But I won't ask you to put yourselves at risk. Speaking publicly might anger other landowners, might make things difficult for you. Mr. Hartley, Timothy's father, stepped forward. Your Grace, begging your pardon, but that's nonsense. You and the Duchess stuck your necks out for us. Time we returned the favor. We'll testify, Mrs. Harrison added. Every one of us who's benefited. Let them try to call this irrational when they hear what it's actually done. Adrian felt his throat tighten. Thank you. Don't thank us yet, Wickham said from the back of the barn. We still have to win. Dr. Whitmore's response arrived a week later by courier. Lillian's hand shook as she opened it, Adrian standing close enough to catch her if the news was bad. She read in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up, tears streaming down her face. He's coming, she whispered. Whitmore. He's coming to Ravengate to review the research personally, and he's bringing 2 colleagues from Edinburgh, experts in botanical medicine who are willing to evaluate the methodology. Adrian pulled her into his arms. When? 2 weeks. He says if the research is as sound as my letters suggest, he'll testify on my behalf. On our behalf. She pulled back, studying his face. Adrian, this could actually work. If Whitmore validates the science, if the tenants testify to the practical impact, if we can prove the estate is still thriving, we might actually win, Adrian finished. They stood together in the morning room, holding each other while outside the February sun broke through winter clouds for the first time in weeks. But victory, they both knew, was far from guaranteed. Richard Blackthorne arrived at Ravengate 3 days before the court hearing, unannounced and unwelcome. Adrian found him in the library, examining the bookcases like he was already inventorying his future property. "Cousin," Richard said pleasantly, "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to see the estate one last time before it changes hands." "Rather presumptuous, given the court hasn't ruled yet." Richard smiled. "Come now, Adrian, we both know how this ends. You've lost the support of every respectable family in the county. You've allowed your wife to make a mockery of proper social order. The court will have no choice but to find in my favor." "Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll find that innovation matters more than tradition." "Innovation?" Richard laughed. "Is that what you call it? Teaching peasant girls to read? Letting your wife play doctor? Adrian, you've gone soft. Father always said you were too sentimental for the role, but I defended you. Said you'd grow into it properly. Clearly, I was wrong." Adrian felt rage building, but kept his voice level. "You never understood what this estate actually needs." "I understand that it needs a duke who knows his place and keeps everyone else in theirs, not one who lets his duchess lead him around by the nose. Lillian doesn't lead me anywhere. She walks beside me." "How touching." Richard's smile turned cruel. "Tell me, does she know you're going to lose? That in a few days she'll be the wife of a former duke with no estate, no income, no influence? What will she do then, do you think? Run back to her father's vicarage? Continue her little medical experiments without resources or protection?" Adrian stepped forward, close enough that Richard had to look up to meet his eyes. "She'll do what she's always done," Adrian said quietly. "Survive. Adapt. Build something meaningful from whatever circumstances she faces. Because unlike you, Richard, she doesn't need a title or an inheritance to have value. She creates value wherever she goes." Noble words from a man about to lose everything. "I've already lost everything that matters," Adrian said. "I lost 5 years of my wife's companionship because I was too proud to see her worth. The estate, the title, they're just things. Lillian is real, and I'll choose her over Ravengate every single time." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. "You're serious," he said slowly. "You'd actually give up the dukedom." "I'd give up anything to keep from making the same mistakes I made before." Adrian moved to the door. "The hearing is in 3 days. We'll see who the court believes." Dr. Whitmore arrived the next day with his colleagues, Dr. Margaret Ainsworth, a botanist from Edinburgh, and Dr. Samuel Fletcher, a physician with credentials that even Dr. Marsh couldn't dismiss. Lillian met them at the door, professional despite her obvious nerves. "Dr. Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Lady Hartwell." Whitmore was a spare man in his 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Or should I say Duchess? "Your letters never clarified." "Lillian is fine," she said. "Please come in. I've prepared all the documentation you requested." They spent 3 days in Lillian's laboratory, examining every aspect of her research. The plant samples, carefully preserved and labeled. The extraction methods, demonstrated step by step. The clinical records, reviewed case by case. Adrian watched from the doorway as the 3 scientists questioned Lillian with ruthless precision. "Your control group here," Dr. Ainsworth said, pointing to a section of data. "How did you ensure the cases were comparable? Age, health status, and infection severity were matched as closely as possible. Patients were selected randomly from those presenting with similar symptoms." Lillian pulled out additional documentation. "I recorded the selection criteria here." Dr. Fletcher examined a preserved specimen of hedge garlic. "The compound isolation? You achieved this without access to a university laboratory?" "I hired a chemist from Cambridge to assist with the more complex extractions. His credentials and methodology notes are in Appendix C. Hours of questioning. Every assumption challenged. Every conclusion tested." Finally, on the 3rd day, the scientists conferred privately while Lillian and Adrian waited in agonizing silence. When Whitmore emerged, his expression was carefully neutral. "Lady Hartwell, your methodology is sound. The sample size is adequate. The results are statistically significant." He paused. "This is rigorous scientific work that meets or exceeds the standards of most published research I've reviewed." Lillian's knees nearly gave out. Adrian caught her arm, steadying her. "You'll testify to that?" she asked. We all will, Dr. Ainsworth said, emerging from the laboratory. This research deserves publication and peer review. The fact that the Royal Botanical Society rejected it based on scandal rather than scientific merit is a disgrace to the institution. I'll be writing a rather pointed letter to them on that subject, Dr. Fletcher added. But first, we have a court hearing to attend. The courtroom in London was packed. Adrian had expected Richard's supporters, the Ashworths, the Pembertons, various cousins and distant relations who stood to benefit from his removal. He had expected his own solicitor and the expert witnesses. What he hadn't expected was the crowd of tenant families who had made the journey from Ravengate. 50 people crammed into the public gallery, dressed in their best clothes, determined to be heard. The judge, Lord Chief Justice Thornbury, a stern man in his 70s, surveyed the chaos with obvious displeasure. "This is highly irregular," he said. "This is a petition regarding estate management, not a public forum." "With respect, Your Honor," Hartwell stood, "the management of an estate directly impacts those who work the land. Their testimony is relevant to the question of the Duke's fitness to serve." Thornbury's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Proceed, but I'll have order in my court." Well, Richard's solicitor went first, calling witnesses who testified to Adrian's erratic behavior. Lord Ashworth described the school as dangerous radicalism. Lady Pemberton claimed Lillian had bewitched the Duke. Dr. Marsh detailed the illegal medical practice with righteous indignation. Adrian sat through it all, watching his reputation dismantled piece by piece. Then Hartwell stood. "Your Honor, we'll demonstrate that the Duke's support of his wife's work is not irrational devotion, but evidence-based decision-making that has benefited both the estate and its people. We call Dr. James Whitmore to the stand." Whitmore's testimony was devastating in its precision. He walked through Lillian's methodology, explained the statistical significance of her results, compared her work favorably to published research in major journals. "In your professional opinion," Hartwell asked, "does supporting this research indicate irrationality?" "Quite the opposite," Whitmore said. "Supporting rigorously conducted scientific research that demonstrates practical benefit is the mark of an intelligent, forward-thinking leader. Rejecting such research based solely on social convention would be irrational." Dr. Ainsworth and Dr. Fletcher followed, each reinforcing Whitmore's assessment. Then came the tenants. Thomas Cooper testified about keeping his arm. Mrs. Harrison about her daughter's education. The Hartleys about their son's life being saved. One by one, they painted a picture not of a Duke gone mad, but of a community transformed by compassion backed by competence. Finally, Wickham took the stand. "I've managed the Ravengate lands for 20 years, he said in his rough, honest voice. "Served under the current Duke's father and now under him. And I'll tell you plain, this estate is better managed now than it's ever been. The Duke knows every tenant family by name. He walks the fields. He understands the work. And his support of Her Grace's school and medical program hasn't weakened the estate. It's strengthened it." "How so?" Hartwell asked. "Healthy workers are productive workers. Educated children grow into capable adults. When people know their Duke actually cares whether they live or die, they work harder, stay longer, take pride in the land. Ravengate's profits are up 15% over the last 3 years. That's not the result of irrational management." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Thornbury banged his gavel. "Order!" Richard's solicitor stood for cross-examination. "But surely, Mr. Wickham, such unconventional practices set a dangerous precedent. What happens when other estates demand the same treatment?" "Then maybe other estates would be better places to work," Wickham said bluntly. "And maybe fewer children would die from preventable infections." The judge called for a recess. Adrian and Lillian stood in the corridor outside the courtroom, surrounded by their tenants, their expert witnesses, their fragile coalition of the unconventional. "We're winning," Hartwell said quietly. "Thornbury is old-fashioned, but he's not stupid. The evidence is on our side." "Don't celebrate yet," Lillian warned. "Richard still has closing arguments." But for the first time since this nightmare began, Adrian felt genuine hope, because they had done something Richard never anticipated. They had turned the question from, "Is the Duke rational?" to, "What does good estate management actually mean?" And in answering that question, they had proven that compassion and competence weren't opposites. They were partners. Matt. Thornberry delivered his ruling 3 hours later. The courtroom fell silent as the elderly judge reviewed his notes, his expression unreadable. This court has reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, he began. The petitioner argues that the Duke of Ravengate has demonstrated unfitness through support of unconventional practices that violate social norms and legal boundaries. The respondent argues that said support is justified by documented evidence of benefit to both estate and tenants. Adrian reached for Lillian's hand under the table. She gripped it tightly. The question before this court is not whether the Duke's choices are conventional, Thornberry continued. The question is whether they constitute a failure of judgment that renders him unfit to manage his estate. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. The evidence shows that Ravengate's profitability has increased under the current Duke's management, that tenant satisfaction is high, that mortality rates have decreased and educational outcomes have improved. These are measurable, documented facts. Richard's face was turning red. Furthermore, Thornberry said, expert testimony confirms that the Duchess's research meets rigorous scientific standards. Supporting such work is not a sign of compromised judgment. It is a sign of progressive thinking. Adrian's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear. This court finds that while the Duke of Ravengate's methods may be unconventional, they do not constitute grounds for removal. The petition is denied. The courtroom erupted. Tenants cheered. Richard's supporters shouted protests. Lillian buried her face in Adrian's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. Adrian held her while chaos swirled around them, feeling the weight of 5 years of mistakes finally lifting. They had won, not because they had compromised or retreated or played by the old rules, but because they had dared to write new ones. Thornberry's gavel cracked like thunder. Order, I'm not finished. The room quieted. I'm issuing an additional ruling, Thornberry said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. This court recognizes that the Duchess of Ravengate's medical work, while beneficial, currently occupies a legal gray area. Rather than continue to operate in uncertainty, I am recommending that the Crown establish formal protocols for licensed botanical medicine practitioners. He looked directly at Lillian. Her Grace's research demonstrates that there is room in English medicine for approaches beyond traditional physician practice. The law should reflect that reality. Lillian's eyes went wide. This court is adjourned. As Thornberry left the bench, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They hadn't just won the case, they had changed the law, or at least started the process. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by celebrating tenants and vindicated expert witnesses, Adrian pulled Lillian into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time in public. When they broke apart, she was crying and laughing at the same time. We did it, she whispered. You did it, Adrian corrected. I just finally got out of your way. No. Lillian cupped his face. We did this together. Your support made the difference. Your willingness to risk everything was the least you deserved after 5 years of my neglect. Stop. She kissed him again, fierce and quick. Stop punishing yourself for the past. We're here now, together, and we have work to do. Work? Thornberry's recommendation won't implement itself. If we're going to establish formal protocols for botanical medicine, we need to write them, propose them, fight for them. Adrian laughed, the sound full of joy and exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Can we celebrate the victory for at least one evening before starting the next battle? Lillian smiled. One evening. Then we get back to work. They walked out of the courthouse together, hands clasped, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd changed and who had changed them in return. Richard stood on the steps, watching them with an expression of absolute fury. But he was powerless now. His petition denied, his supporters melting away. Adrian didn't gloat, didn't even acknowledge him. He just walked past, his wife at his side, and left his cousin to contemplate the cost of underestimating them both. The door that had stayed closed for 5 years wasn't just open now, it had been ripped off its hinges entirely, and the future stretching ahead was full of possibility. The celebration at Ravengate lasted 3 days. Tenants brought food, musicians appeared from the village, and the great hall that had stood silent and formal for decades, filled with laughter and music and the sound of community claiming its place in the house that had always held itself above them. Adrian stood on the terrace, watching the festivities, Lillian warm against his side, and tried to remember the last time these walls had heard such joy. He couldn't. "Your father would be horrified," Lillian said, reading his thoughts as she so often did now. "My father was horrified by most things that brought people actual happiness." Adrian pulled her closer. "I spent 30 years trying to be him. I'm done with that." "What will you be instead?" "Myself, whatever that turns out to mean." He turned to face her fully. "With you, if you'll have me." Lillian laughed. "We're already married, Adrian. Bit late to be asking." "We had a contract, a business arrangement. I'm asking for something different now." He took both her hands. "I'm asking for a real marriage, partnership, trust. Everything I should have offered you 5 years ago. You're offering it now. That's what matters." They kissed while below them the celebration continued, and for the first time in his adult life, Adrian felt completely at peace with where he stood and who he stood with. But peace, he was learning, was just the foundation. The real work came after. Dr. Whitmore stayed on at Ravengate for 2 weeks, working with Lillian to refine the manuscript that would become her book. They transformed the library into a war room, papers and illustrations covering every surface, arguments about botanical nomenclature echoing through the halls. Adrian brought them tea one afternoon and found them debating the proper way to describe hedge garlic's antiseptic properties. "The language needs to be accessible," Lillian insisted. "If only physicians can understand it, we failed." "If it's too simple, the medical establishment won't take it seriously," Whitmore countered. "Then we write it twice." Adrian set down the tea tray. "Technical appendices for the scientists, clear instructions for everyone else." They both turned to stare at him. "That's actually brilliant," Whitmore said slowly. "2 editions, one scholarly, one practical. Appeal to both audiences." Lillian smiled. "See, I told you he was useful." "For more than just carrying tea, I hope," Adrian said dryly. "Much more." Lillian stood, crossing to him. "Dr. Whitmore and I have been discussing the Edinburgh work, the publishing timeline. And I want you to come with me, not just to Edinburgh. I want you as a co-author on the research. Your contributions to documenting the clinical cases, your work formalizing the school and medical program, your testimony in court, all of it matters. This shouldn't be just my work. It's ours." Adrian felt his throat tighten. "Lillian, I can't take credit for your research." "You're not taking credit. You're receiving recognition for the work you've actually done." She took his hands. "Besides, having a duke's name on a medical text about accessible healing might actually help it reach the people who need it most. Your title gives it credibility I can't provide alone." "I thought you wanted to be taken seriously on your own merits." "I do. But I'm also pragmatic enough to use every advantage we have, including your position." Lillian's eyes were steady. "Sure. We're partners now. In everything. That means sharing both the work and the recognition." Whitmore cleared his throat. "If I might interject, Lady Hartwell is right. The combination of rigorous science and aristocratic endorsement could be exactly what's needed to overcome institutional resistance. And frankly, Your Grace, your testimony in court proved you understand this material well enough to speak authoritatively about it." Adrian looked between them, the renowned publisher and his brilliant wife, both watching him with expectation and trust. "Very well," he said. "Partners." Lillian kissed him, quick and warm. "Partners." The letter from the Royal Botanical Society arrived in March, just as the first crocuses pushed through the last of the winter snow. Adrian found Lillian in the conservatory, examining early spring growth, and handed her the envelope without comment. She opened it slowly, her expression carefully neutral as she read. Then she laughed, a sound of pure, vindicated triumph. "They're inviting me to present at the spring symposium," she said. "Not apologizing for rejecting me before, mind you, just casually inviting me as if nothing happened." "What will you tell them?" Lillian studied the letter, her fingers tracing the society's seal. 5 months ago, this invitation had been everything she'd worked toward. The validation she'd dreamed of since she was 12 years old, mourning a sister and vowing to make her death matter. Now it felt smaller somehow, less essential. "I'll accept," she said finally, but on my terms. I'll present the research, but I'll also present the story. How the society rejected it based on scandal. How a court of law recognized its validity before they did. How institutional gatekeeping nearly prevented life-saving medicine from reaching the people who needed it. Adrian smiled. You're going to make them uncomfortable. I'm going to make them think. There's a difference. Lillian folded the letter. The society needs to understand that rejecting research based on the researcher's gender or social acceptability rather than scientific merit is itself unscientific. If they want to remain relevant, they need to change. They won't like hearing that. Good. Comfort is the enemy of progress. The spring symposium took place on a warm April day in London. The Royal Botanical Society's lecture hall was packed. Word had spread about the controversial Duchess who had challenged a duke's cousin in court and won. Lillian stood backstage, elegant in a deep blue dress that Adrian had insisted she commission because, if you're going to revolutionize botanical medicine, you might as well look stunning while doing it. Adrian adjusted her collar, his hands gentle. Nervous? Terrified, Lillian admitted. These people wanted nothing to do with me 6 months ago. Now they're here expecting a spectacle. Then give them science instead. That's what you're good at. What if they dismiss it again? What if all of this, the court case, the validation, everything, still isn't enough? Adrian cupped her face. Then they're fools. But their foolishness doesn't diminish your work. It never did. The stage manager appeared. Lady Hartwell, we're ready. Lillian took a deep breath. Adrian kissed her forehead. Go change the world, he whispered. She walked onto the stage to scattered applause, some genuine, some merely polite. The society members sat in the front rows, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. Lillian stood at the podium, looking out at the audience that had rejected her, and felt her fear transform into something else entirely. Determination. Gentlemen of the Royal Botanical Society, she began, and the few ladies allowed in attendance, I'm here to present research on the medicinal properties of common English plants. Research that many of you rejected 6 months ago, not because it lacked scientific merit, but because you found my methods of acquiring it inappropriate. The room went silent. You were wrong, Lillian continued calmly, not about the importance of proper methodology or ethical research. Those concerns are valid. You were wrong to assume that a woman working outside traditional academic institutions couldn't produce rigorous science. You were wrong to let scandal influence your scientific judgment, and you were wrong to prioritize your institution's reputation over potentially life-saving medical knowledge. Someone in the front row stood to leave. Lillian raised her voice slightly. But I'm not here to berate you. I'm here to give you a second chance to get this right. So please, sit down, look at the evidence, and decide based on science rather than prejudice. The man sat. For the next hour, Lillian presented her research with crystalline clarity. Clinical data on 63 cases, chemical analysis of medicinal compounds, comparative mortality rates between conventional treatment and botanical intervention, every claim backed by documentation, every conclusion supported by evidence. When she finished, the room sat in stunned silence. Then Dr. Whitmore stood from the back row. I've reviewed this research extensively, he said, his voice carrying. The methodology is sound, the sample size adequate, the results statistically significant. This is work of the highest caliber. The fact that it was conducted by a duchess in her estate laboratory rather than a professor in a university setting is irrelevant. Science is science, regardless of where it happens. Dr. Ainsworth stood next. I concur. This research meets or exceeds the standards of most published botanical studies I've reviewed. One by one, other voices joined. Scientists who had reviewed the data, physicians who had witnessed the results, even a few society members who had the courage to admit they'd been wrong. Finally, the society's president, Sir Edmund Hargrove, a stiff man in his 70s, stood. Lady Hartwell, he said formally, on behalf of the Royal Botanical Society, I must acknowledge that we made an error in judgment. Your research deserves publication and peer recognition. We would be honored if you would permit us to publish it in our quarterly journal. Lillian smiled. Thank you, Sir Edmund, but I've already committed to publishing with Dr. Whitmore's press. His offer came when yours did not, and I don't abandon partnerships based on convenience. Hargrove's face reddened. I see. However, Lillian continued, I would be willing to present a summary of the findings in your journal with full credit to Dr. Whitmore's forthcoming book. That way, your members can access the research while supporting the publisher who believed in it from the beginning. It was a masterful compromise, giving the society a chance to save face while maintaining her commitment to Whitmore. Hargrove nodded stiffly. That would be acceptable. The applause that followed was genuine this time, loud and sustained. Lillian left the stage to find Adrian waiting in the wings, his eyes bright with pride and something deeper. That was magnificent, he said. That was terrifying, Lillian corrected, but effective. You gave them exactly what they deserved, accountability wrapped in grace. I learned from the best. She took his hand. Come on, we have a publisher to celebrate with. The book, Medicinal Flora of Britain, A Practical Guide to Botanical Healing, was published in September. By October, it had sold 3,000 copies. By December, physicians across England were requesting additional printings. The medical establishment's response was mixed. Some doctors dismissed it as folk medicine dressed up in scientific language. Others began incorporating the methods into their practice, particularly in rural areas where access to conventional medicine was limited. But the real impact came from somewhere unexpected. Women bought it, hundreds of them, thousands. Mothers and midwives, teachers and nurses, anyone who had ever felt helpless watching someone suffer because professional medical care was too expensive, or too far away, or too dismissive of female knowledge. They read Lillian's careful instructions. They learned to identify the plants. They began treating minor ailments and preventing infections and saving lives. And slowly, quietly, the landscape of English medicine began to shift. Letters poured into Ravengate from across the country. Women writing to say thank you, to share their own successes, to ask questions about specific cases. Lillian answered everyone, building a network of correspondence that connected her to healers she would never meet, but whose work extended her impact far beyond what she could accomplish alone. One letter in particular made her cry. It was from a woman in Cornwall whose daughter had died of an infected wound 5 years earlier. The woman had read the book and learned to recognize the symptoms, learned to prepare the treatments. When her youngest son cut his hand badly on farm equipment, she knew what to do. The boy lived. This is what Margaret would have wanted, the woman wrote. Knowledge shared so no other mother has to watch her child die from ignorance. Thank you for making my daughter's death mean something. Lillian read the letter to Adrian that night, her voice breaking over the words. Every life we save, she whispered. Every child who survives. It matters. It always mattered, Adrian said gently. The world is just finally catching up. Us. The formal protocols for licensed botanical medicine practitioners that Lord Justice Thornbury had recommended took 18 months to establish. Lillian worked with a committee of physicians, botanists, and legal scholars to create certification standards that balanced scientific rigor with accessibility. The first class of certified practitioners graduated in the spring of 1827. 15 women and 3 men trained in plant identification, compound preparation, clinical observation, and ethical treatment practices. One of them was Sarah Wickham, Thomas Wickham's granddaughter, the little girl Lillian had saved from infection 5 years ago. She was 15 now, bright and determined, and she had announced her intention to become a botanical healer the day the certification program was established. You saved my life, Sarah told Lillian at the graduation ceremony. Now I want to save others. Lillian embraced her, feeling the circle complete itself. The child she'd healed growing into the healer who would help others. This was legacy, not titles or estates or names carved in stone. This was a knowledge passing from one generation to the next, growing and spreading and transforming lives. The school at Ravengate expanded. What had started as 9 girls meeting secretly in a converted carriage house became a formal institution with 23 students, 2 full-time teachers, and a curriculum that covered literature, mathematics, science, and practical skills. Other estates began requesting information. How was it structured? How was it funded? Could they establish something similar? Adrian found himself writing letters to neighboring landowners, explaining the program, sharing results, making the case that educated tenants were productive tenants. Some dismissed him, called him radical or foolish or worse, but some listened. By 1828, 5 other estates in the county had established schools for tenant daughters. Small programs, carefully managed, but real nonetheless. Lord Pemberton still refused to speak to them. Lady Ashworth cut them at every social event. Adrian couldn't find it in himself to care. "Do you ever regret it?" Lillian asked one evening as they walked the north hedgerows at sunset. "Their ritual now, their time together away from the work that filled their days." Losing the gentry's approval? Being seen as unconventional? Adrian was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he smiled. "I regret nothing that led me to you, to this, to actually mattering instead of just existing within inherited privilege." "That's very poetic for a duke." "I learned from a botanist who writes like a poet." Lillian laughed and leaned into him, comfortable and close in a way that had taken years to build, but now felt natural as breathing. They walked in silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the fields gold and amber. "Edinburgh is offering me a research position," Lillian said finally. "Part-time. I could continue my work, collaborate with other scientists, access their laboratories and libraries." Adrian felt his stomach clench. "Would you have to live there?" 3 months a year. The rest I could work from here." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "But I'd only accept if you came with me. I meant what I said about partnership. I won't choose between my work and my marriage again." "Then I'll come with you." Adrian pulled her close. "Ravengate survived centuries before I was born. It'll survive a few months each year without me. Wickham can manage the day-to-day operations. The school is stable. The medical program is formalized." He kissed her forehead. "And I refuse to spend another day apart from you if I can help it." "Even if it means being known as the Duke who follows his wife to university?" "Especially then. Let them talk. We know the truth." Brown. The truth was this. Their marriage had been saved not by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by the slow, patient work of actually seeing each other. Adrian learned Lillian's morning routines, her favorite tea, the way she chewed her lower lip when concentrating on difficult problems. He learned that she was brilliant and stubborn, and sometimes insecure about whether her work truly mattered. Lillian learned Adrian's fears, his regrets, the weight he carried from trying to be the Duke his father expected instead of the man he actually was. She learned that beneath the aristocratic reserve was someone capable of profound tenderness and fierce loyalty once his walls finally came down. They learned to argue productively, to compromise without surrendering core principles, to support each other's dreams without losing themselves in the process. It wasn't always easy. There were still misunderstandings, still moments of frustration when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But they kept choosing each other. Every day, every difficult conversation, every time fear whispered that opening up was too risky, they chose partnership over pride. And slowly, the marriage that had begun as a cold transaction transformed into something neither of them had expected. Love. Real, complicated, hard-won love. Look, 5 years after Adrian first knocked on Lillian's locked door, they stood together in the East Wing Conservatory, the room where he'd finally admitted his fear, where she'd finally let him see her completely. It was their anniversary. Not the official one marking their wedding, but the private one marking the day everything changed. 5 years since you knocked, Lillian said, standing by the window where moonlight pooled across the floor, exactly as it had that November night. 5 years since you didn't answer, Adrian added. Best thing you ever didn't do. I was so angry that night. Angry that you'd ignored me for years and then suddenly wanted to know me just because the Royal Botanical Society acknowledged my work. You had every right to be angry, but you kept trying anyway, kept showing up at dawn, kept asking questions, kept choosing to see me even when I made it difficult. Lillian turned to face him. Why? Adrian crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Because, for the first time in my life, I met someone who didn't need me to be the Duke of Ravengate. You needed me to be Adrian, just Adrian, and I wanted to be worthy of that. You are worthy of it. You always were. You just needed to believe it yourself. They stood together in the moonlit conservatory, and Adrian remembered the man he'd been 5 years ago, rigid, controlled, terrified of anything that threatened his carefully maintained authority. That man was gone, transformed by the woman in his arms and the work they'd built together. "Tell me something," Lillian said. "If you could go back to our wedding day, knowing everything you know now, what would you do differently?" Adrian considered. "I'd knock on your door that very first night. I'd ask about your interests, your dreams, your sister Margaret. I'd offer partnership instead of isolation. And if I'd said no, if I'd wanted the isolation you offered, then I would have kept trying until you believed I meant it, until you trusted me enough to let me in." He cupped her face gently. "But I can't change the past. I can only promise you the future." "What kind of future?" "One where that door," he gestured to the hallway that had once divided them, "stays open forever. Where we walk through life side by side instead of in parallel. Where your work matters as much as mine. Where love isn't a weakness but the strongest thing we have." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "That's quite a promise. I've had 5 years to think about it. I intend to spend the rest of my life keeping it." She kissed him then, deep and sure, and Adrian tasted salt from her tears and sweetness from her smile. When they finally broke apart, Lillian rested her forehead against his. "The East Wing door," she said, "the one that stayed locked for 5 years. What about it? I want to take it off its hinges, permanently, so there's no possibility of it ever closing again." Adrian laughed, the sound full of joy. "Done. We'll do it tomorrow." "No," Lillian pulled back, her eyes bright. "Now, tonight, this moment." So they did. In the middle of the night, the Duke and Duchess of Ravengate removed the door from Lillian's chamber, the physical barrier that had symbolized 5 years of silence and separation. They carried it down to the grounds and built a bonfire, feeding the old wood into flames that lit up the November sky. Servants emerged from their quarters, drawn by the light. Tenants who lived close enough to see the glow came to investigate. Soon the lawn was filled with people, watching the door burn, understanding somehow that this was more than destruction. This was transformation. Wickham arrived with his grandchildren, Sarah among them. Mrs. Brennan appeared with kitchen staff. The girls from the school came with their families. Someone started singing. Others joined in. Within minutes, the impromptu gathering had become a celebration. Adrian pulled Lillian into a dance on the lawn, spinning her beneath stars and firelight, while their people cheered. "They think we're mad," Lillian said, breathless and laughing. "They're right, but we're also happy. I'll take mad and happy over sane and miserable." "Me too." They danced until the fire burned low and the crowd dispersed and the November cold drove them back inside. But the door was gone, reduced to ash and memory, and in its place was open space, room to move freely between what had been separate quarters, room to build a shared life instead of parallel ones. The final letter came in December, just as the first snow of winter began to fall. It was from the Royal Botanical Society, formal and official and completely unexpected. Lillian read it twice, then handed it to Adrian without a word. He scanned the elaborate prose, his eyebrows climbing higher with each sentence. The society was establishing a new position, Fellow of Botanical Medicine. It would recognize researchers who had made significant contributions to the field, regardless of their academic background or institutional affiliation. Lady Lillian Hartwell, Duchess of Ravengate, was invited to be the first recipient. "They want to name a fellowship after you," Adrian said slowly. "A permanent position that recognizes your work." "They want to save face," Lillian corrected, "by creating a position that acknowledges they were wrong to reject me in the first place. Will you accept?" Lillian was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter that represented everything she'd once dreamed of: official recognition, institutional legitimacy, her place in scientific history secured. "Yes," she said finally, "but I'm going to use the platform to push for more women in science, more accessible research, more willingness to learn from traditional knowledge. They're giving me a voice. I'm going to use it to make noise." Adrian grinned. "I'd expect nothing less, but..." The investiture ceremony took place in January at the Society's headquarters in London. Lillian wore a gown of deep green that brought out the amber in her eyes. and she stood before the assembled scientists with her head high and her shoulders straight. Sir Edmund Hargrove presented the fellowship with a speech about innovation and progress that carefully avoided mentioning how hard he'd fought against both. Lillian accepted with grace, thanking the society for the honor. Then she delivered her acceptance speech. "This fellowship represents a step forward," she began, "but only a step. True progress means recognizing that knowledge doesn't only come from universities and laboratories. It comes from midwives and herbalists and mothers who have spent centuries learning what works. Our job as scientists isn't to dismiss that knowledge. It's to validate it, test it, make it accessible to everyone who needs it." She looked out at the audience, seeing skepticism and interest and discomfort warring on different faces. "I'm honored to be the first fellow of botanical medicine, but I won't be satisfied until I'm not the only woman in this room, until girls like my students at Ravengate can dream of becoming scientists without being told it's impossible, until healing is seen as a collaborative effort between trained physicians and traditional practitioners rather than a battle for authority." She paused, letting the words sink in. "So thank you for this fellowship. Thank you for recognizing my work. But know that I'm just getting started, and I hope you're ready for everything that comes next." The applause was uncertain at first, then grew stronger as the more progressive members of the society stood. Adrian watched from the audience, his heart full to bursting with pride and love and absolute certainty that he had married someone extraordinary. After the ceremony, as they left the society's building together, Lillian turned to him. "Did I go too far?" "You were perfect," Adrian said. "Gracious and revolutionary all at once. They're going to resist. Every change I push for, they'll fight. Then we'll fight back. Together." Lillian smiled and took his hand. Together. They walked out into the London evening, hand in hand, the fellowship medal in Lillian's bag and their future stretching ahead full of battles to fight and lives to save and knowledge to share. Behind them, the Royal Botanical Society would spend the next decade catching up to where Lillian had already been. Ahead of them, Ravengate waited, their home, their work, their legacy being built one educated girl and one healed child at a time. And between them, finally, after 5 years of silence and 5 years of partnership, was the love that had almost been lost, but had instead become the foundation everything else was built on. The door that had stayed closed for 5 years would never close again. Because in the end, the greatest transformation at Ravengate Hall wasn't the Duchess becoming visible to the world. It was the Duke learning to see her. And once he saw her, truly saw her, there was no looking away. There was only forward. Together. Always. The snow fell soft on London streets as they walked toward their waiting carriage, toward home, toward all the work that still waited and all the love they'd finally found. And somewhere in the winter sky, if one believed in such things, a young girl named Margaret smiled at the life her death had helped create. Because knowledge shared was never wasted. And love, real love, could heal more than any medicine ever made. It could heal the wounds time left behind. It could transform strangers into partners. It could open doors that had stayed locked for far too long. And once those doors opened, there was no telling what miracles might walk through.